Welcome back to the channel. Today's story brings us face to face with an enemy we cannot negotiate with, cannot fight, and cannot conquer. It is a story of ultimate isolation, taking place in a white void at the very bottom of the earth. It is arguably the most tragic exploration event of the 20th century, yet few people understand the true, minute-by-minute psychological toll of the men who marched into the abyss, knowing the ice was closing like a door behind them. We are building a global community here of people who appreciate dark, atmospheric storytelling. I am always fascinated to see where you are all listening from, whether you're working the night shift, studying, or just relaxing in the dark. So, before we step off the edge of the map, do me a favor, scroll down and leave a comment. Let me know what city or country you are watching from right now. I read every single one. As always, if you appreciate these long-form deep dives, please leave a like on the video. It helps the signal cut through the noise. Now, put on your headphones, turn off the lights, let's go to 1910. Chapter 1. The Alien Planet. To understand the nightmare of the Terra Nova Expedition, you must first strip away everything you think you know about geography. When we look at a globe today, Antarctica is just the white patch at the bottom. We know its shape. We have satellite images of its mountain ranges. We have research stations with internet connections, heated living quarters, and heavy-duty aircraft that fly in and out on a regular schedule. We view it as a harsh environment, yes, but ultimately a known quantity. In 1910, Antarctica was not a place. It was an alien planet. It is the coldest, windiest, driest, and highest continent on Earth. It is a landmass the size of the United States and Mexico combined, covered entirely by a sheet of ice that is, in some places, nearly 3 miles thick. The sheer weight of this ice is so immense that it physically depresses the bedrock of the continent deep into the Earth's mantle. But the most terrifying aspect of the Antarctic interior is its absolute crushing sterility. Once you leave the coastal fringes where the penguins and seals gather, there is nothing. No trees, no bushes, no insects, no bacteria. There is no natural food chain. It is a continent that actively rejects biology. If you walk into the interior of Antarctica, you are the only living organism for thousands of square miles, and the environment will immediately begin the methodical physical process of removing your heat, your energy, and your life. It was into this lethal, indifferent void that Captain Robert Falcon Scott decided to march. Scott was a product of the Edwardian era, an officer of the British Royal Navy, and a man carrying the crushing weight of an empire's expectations. At the turn of the 20th century, the British Empire spanned the globe. They had mapped the oceans, conquered continents, and planted their flag in nearly every corner of the earth. But the poles, the absolute top and bottom of the world, remained entirely out of reach. They were the final geographical prizes left on the board. Scott had already been to the Antarctic once before, leading the Discovery Expedition from 1901 to 1904. He had ventured further south than anyone in human history, but he had not reached the pole. The failure, though celebrated as a heroic attempt, gnawed at him. He was a man driven by a profound sense of duty, a complex mixture of personal ambition and naval discipline. He believed that reaching the South Pole was not just a scientific endeavor, it was a matter of national prestige. The Union Jack had to be the first flag planted at the bottom of the world. To achieve this, Scott assembled a massive, incredibly complex expedition. He named it after the ship that would take them there, the Terra Nova, which translates from Latin as New Land. The plan was a logistical behemoth. The South Pole lay roughly 800 miles from the edge of the frozen sea, where they would make their base camp. To get there, they would have to cross the Great Ice Barrier, a floating shelf of solid ice the size of France, then climb the Beardmore Glacier, a 120-mile-long, treacherous ramp of shattered, crevassed blue ice, to finally reach the high polar plateau. Once on the plateau, they would have to march hundreds of miles at an altitude of 10,000 feet, where the air was dangerously thin and temperatures routinely plunged to -40 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. And then, If they survived the 800-mile march there, they had to turn around and walk the 800 miles back. It was a 1,600-mile round trip across an alien world, and every single ounce of food, fuel, and shelter had to be hauled by the men themselves. To overcome this, Scott brought a mechanized, multi-tiered transport system. He brought dogs, despite his personal distrust of using them for hauling. He brought 19 sturdy white Manchurian ponies, believing their broad hooves and immense strength would be perfectly suited for pulling heavy sledges across the Great Ice Barrier. And, in a burst of Edwardian technological optimism, he brought 3 experimental internal combustion motor sledges, essentially early primitive tanks, designed to drag massive amounts of supplies across the ice. It was a grand, beautiful, fatally flawed design. Scott was preparing for a military siege against the weather, bringing an armada of men and animals to conquer the ice through sheer British determination. The vehicle for this siege was the Terra Nova, an old, rugged Scottish whaling ship built entirely of wood, designed to withstand the crushing pressure of pack ice. On June 15, 1910, the ship departed from Cardiff, Wales, to the cheers of thousands. But as the ship sailed south, the reality of the undertaking began to set in. The Terra Nova was dangerously overloaded. It was packed not just with 65 men, but with 3 years' worth of provisions, tons of scientific equipment, disassembled wooden huts, thousands of gallons of fuel, the 3 heavy motor sledges, 33 dogs, and 19 terrified ponies housed in makeshift wooden stalls on the upper deck. The ship sat so low in the water that it barely cleared the waves, and as they left the safety of New Zealand in late November, steering directly south toward the ice, the Southern Ocean unleashed its fury. They entered the latitudes known to sailors as the Roaring Forties and the Furious 50s, a stretch of unbroken ocean circling the globe where the winds spin unhindered by any landmass, creating the most violent seas on Earth. The Terra Nova was hit by a monstrous gale. The storm was biblical in its intensity. Massive, grey walls of water crashed over the decks of the overloaded ship. The wooden hull groaned and shrieked under the immense pressure. Below decks, it was a scene of absolute claustrophobic terror. The men were violently thrown from their bunks. The dogs howled in panic, swinging from their chains as the ship rolled drastically from side to side. But the true horror was happening on the upper deck, where the ponies were kept. As the ship pitched violently, the terrified animals lost their footing. They thrashed wildly in their narrow wooden stalls, kicking and screaming in a way that sounded chillingly human over the roar of the wind. 2 of the ponies were thrown so violently against the bulkheads that they broke their legs and had to be euthanized during the storm. Their bodies dragged to the rail and heaved into the churning black ocean. Worse still, the sheer volume of water washing over the deck began to flood the engine room. The coal dust, mixed with the seawater, turned into a thick black sludge that clogged the ship's bilge pumps. The water level in the engine room began to rise dangerously fast. If the water reached the boiler fires, the engines would die, the ship would lose all power, turn sideways into the massive waves, and capsize. In the suffocating, pitch-black belly of the ship, officers and scientists formed bucket lines, passing heavy iron buckets of black, freezing water up the ladders for 24 hours straight. Men sang sea shanties to keep from losing their minds to panic, working until their muscles cramped and their hands bled. They survived the storm, but the ocean had delivered a terrifying opening statement. It was a stark reminder of their fragility. They were a tiny wooden speck carrying a cargo of fragile, warm-blooded animals and ambitious men, venturing into a place where they did not belong. By early December, the violent, churning grey waves gave way to something far more ominous, the pack ice. The ocean surface began to solidify. First came the pancake ice, circular, flat disks of frozen saltwater bobbing on the swell. Then, the disks froze together, forming massive grinding flows of white ice that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The Terra Nova became a battering ram. The captain would drive the heavy wooden prow of the ship directly into the ice floes, riding up onto the ice to crack it with the ship's weight, then backing up and doing it again. The noise was deafening, a constant rhythmic, explosive booming that echoed through the lower decks like artillery fire. They fought their way through the pack ice for 20 long, agonizing days. They were trapped, surrounded by a blinding white desert of frozen ocean, moving at a snail's pace, burning precious coal just to gain a few miles a day. And then, on December 30th, 1910, the ice finally broke. The Terra Nova sailed out into the clear, dark waters of the Ross Sea. The men crowded the rails, looking south. Rising out of the freezing water, towering against a pristine blue sky, was the continent of Antarctica. It was a breathtaking, terrifying sight. Massive glaciers spilled down from jagged volcanic peaks. The air was so cold and so utterly devoid of moisture that distance became impossible to judge. Mountains that looked 10 miles away were actually 100 miles distant. The silence of the place was absolute. It was a heavy, ancient quiet that seemed to absorb the sounds of the ship. As they dropped anchor near Ross Island, preparing to unload the immense cargo and build the wooden hut that would serve as their only shelter for the next 3 years, the men of the Terra Nova Expedition felt a profound sense of isolation settle over them. The ship would soon depart, returning to New Zealand before the ocean froze solid and trapped it. When it sailed away, the 65 men left on the ice would be entirely cut off from the human race. There would be no telegraphs, no supply drops, no possibility of rescue. They would be standing on the shore of a frozen alien world, with nothing but the wood, the canvas, and the food they had brought with them to keep the darkness at bay. They had arrived at the edge of the map, and the long, dark winter was waiting. Chapter 2. The Phantom in the Ice. The first thing you must understand about the edge of the Antarctic continent is that it is not solid ground. It is an illusion. When the Terra Nova finally battered its way through the hundreds of miles of floating pack ice and reached the Ross Sea in January of 1911, the men did not step out onto dirt or rock. They stepped out onto the fast ice, a vast, frozen sheet of seawater attached to the shoreline of Ross Island. Above them loomed Mount Erebus, a massive, active volcano, its peak smoking silently against a sky of bruised, unnatural purple. The juxtaposition was unsettling. A mountain of fire rising out of an ocean of ice, presiding over a landscape that looked less like Earth and more like the surface of a dead moon. They chose a small volcanic promontory to build their base, naming it Cape Evans. But to get their supplies from the ship to the Cape, they had to cross 1.5 miles of this frozen ocean. This was the beginning of their physical torment. The unloading of the Terra Nova was a brutal, exhausting, round-the-clock military operation. It was summer in the Antarctic, which meant the sun never set. It simply circled the horizon, casting long, strange shadows across the ice, destroying the men's circadian rhythms. They worked in a state of permanent, surreal twilight exhaustion. They had to move tons of cargo, heavy wooden crates of biscuits, barrels of seal meat, scientific instruments, coal, timber, and the animals. The 19 Manchurian ponies, half mad from the violent sea crossing, were lowered onto the ice in slings. The dogs, 33 of them, were chained in long lines, their manic howling echoing endlessly off the glaciers. But the ice was treacherous. Because it was summer, the frozen sea was decaying. It was riddled with hidden cracks, soft spots, and leads, dark, terrifying veins of open black water that could open up beneath your feet without a sound. It was here that Captain Robert Falcon Scott's grand technological vision suffered its first fatal blow. The pride of the expedition were the 3 experimental motor sledges. These were massive, heavy tracked vehicles, the ancestors of the modern snowcat, designed to drag tons of supplies across the Great Ice Barrier and spare the men the agonizing labor of man-hauling. They were the ultimate symbol of Edwardian confidence, machines built to conquer nature. As they were carefully lowering the 3rd and largest motor sledge from the deck of the ship down onto the sea ice, the surface gave way. The ice didn't shatter, It simply dissolved. The men hauling the ropes felt the sudden, terrifying slack. They screamed warnings as the heavy metal tracks of the machine broke through the frozen crust. For a suspended, agonizing second, the sledge hung halfway into the black water. Then, with a sickening crunch of breaking ice and snapping ropes, the machine plunged through. The men scrambled backward, throwing themselves flat onto the stable ice as the frozen sea opened up. They watched, helpless, as the heavy internal combustion engine, the machine that was supposed to carry them to the pole, sank like a stone into the freezing, bottomless depths of the Ross Sea. It vanished into the black water, leaving only a violent swirling of bubbles and broken ice in its wake. It was a devastating omen. The continent had barely been touched, and already it was consuming their technology. It was a stark reminder that in this environment, heavy, complex metal was a liability, not an asset. Despite the loss, the men pushed forward. On the black volcanic rock of Cape Evans, they constructed their winter quarters. It was a prefabricated wooden building, 50 feet long and 25 feet wide, insulated with dried seaweed. It was a sturdy, well-designed box, but when you look at photographs of the Cape Evans hut, you realize on one side were the officers and scientists, on the other, the seamen. Even at the end of the world, fighting for their lives against the cold, the British maintained their rigid class structure. They brought a gramophone. They brought a massive library of books. They brought portraits of the king. They were desperately trying to build a tiny warm bubble of London society to hold back the encroaching void. By late January, the interior of the hut was a sensory assault. It smelled of unwashed wool, heavy tobacco smoke, wet dog fur, and the thick, greasy smoke of the seal blubber they burned for fuel. The walls sweated with condensation from their breath, which then froze into sheets of interior ice near the floorboards. But the true psychological test began in the final days of January, when the Terra Nova blew its whistle for the last time. The ship had to leave. If it stayed any longer, the ocean would freeze solid around its wooden hull and crush it. The men stood on the black rocks of the cape, their breath pluming in the freezing air, and watched as the tall wooden masts of the ship slowly shrank against the horizon, eventually disappearing into the white haze of the north. When the ship was gone, the silence that rushed in to fill the space was absolute. It was a physical weight. There were now 65 men left on the ice. They were entirely cut off from the human race. If the hut caught fire, they would freeze to death in hours. If a disease swept through the camp, there was no hospital. If the ship struck an iceberg on its way back to New Zealand and sank, no one in the world would ever know they were there, and no rescue ship would ever come. They were marooned on an alien planet. But Scott did not have time to let the isolation settle in. Winter was coming. The sun would soon set for 4 months of total darkness. Before that happened, they had to execute a critical mission. They had to lay the supply depots. To survive the 800-mile march to the pole the following year, they could not carry all their food with them. They had to push out onto the Great Ice Barrier now before the winter fell, and bury massive caches of food and fuel along the route. The most important of these was to be named 1-ton depot, intended to be dropped exactly at the 80 parallel. It would be their lifeline on the desperate march back from the pole a year later. In February, Scott led a team out onto the Great Ice Barrier to lay the depot, and it was here, on the flat, white expanse of the floating ice shelf, that the true agonizing reality of Antarctic travel revealed itself. The Manchurian ponies, which Scott had banked the entire expedition on, were a disaster. They were majestic animals, but they were biologically unsuited for the deep, soft snow of the barrier. Their small, hard hooves punched straight through the crust. They sank to their bellies, thrashing and screaming in terror, exhausting themselves with every step. The men had to drag the ponies out of the snow, strapping makeshift wooden snowshoes to their hooves, but the animals were breaking down. They were freezing, starving, and losing their minds from the endless, blinding white glare. The cold was sharper than anything they had anticipated for the summer months. It cracked the skin on their faces. It froze their sweat into sheets of ice beneath their heavy wool clothing. Every morning, Putting on their frozen canvas boots was a half-hour ordeal of agonizing pain, beating the stiff canvas with wooden mallets just to force their bruised feet inside. Because the ponies were dying, Scott made a fatal calculation. They were moving too slowly. The weather was deteriorating rapidly as the winter approached. They could not reach the 80 parallel. Scott ordered the men to stop and build the depot 30 miles short of its intended location. 30 miles. On a map of the world, it is a microscopic distance. On the Great Ice Barrier, it is a gap that can swallow a man's life. Scott reasoned that it was better to save the remaining ponies and drop the supplies early than to push them to death. They buried a literal ton of pemmican, biscuits, and paraffin fuel in the snow, marked it with a black flag, and turned back for the safety of the wooden hut at Cape Evans. They didn't know it at the time, but dropping 1-ton depot 30 miles short would become the most consequential mistake of the entire expedition. It was a geographic death sentence, signed in the snow a year before it would be executed. Exhausted, frostbitten, and demoralized by the failure of the ponies and the loss of the motor sledge, Scott's depot party dragged themselves back to Cape Evans. They were looking forward to the warmth of the blubber stove, the safety of the wooden walls, and the quiet camaraderie of their isolated brotherhood. But when Scott walked through the heavy wooden doors of the hut, the atmosphere was not one of relief. The men inside were tense. The air was thick with a new, terrifying anxiety. A message had been waiting for him. Before the Terra Nova had sailed north to return to civilization, Scott had ordered a small sub-party, led by Lieutenant Victor Campbell, to sail east along the edge of the Great Ice Barrier to explore an area known as King Edward VII Land. Campbell's team had sailed along the massive cliffs of ice, looking for a place to land and set up their own secondary winter camp. As Campbell's ship sailed into a large indentation in the ice known as the Bay of Whales, the fog had lifted, and there, anchored to the fast ice in a place where absolutely no human beings were supposed to be, Campbell saw the masts of another ship. It was not a lost whaling vessel. It was not a derelict ghost ship. It was the Fram, the most famous, heavily reinforced polar exploration ship in the world. Campbell and his men had rowed across the black water, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They had climbed out onto the ice and walked toward the foreign camp. What they found there shattered the fundamental premise of the British expedition. The camp was a marvel of Arctic efficiency. There were dozens of men, dressed not in stiff British wool, but in supple, perfectly tailored Inuit clothing made of wolfskin and reindeer fur. They moved across the ice with an effortless, predatory grace on wooden skis, and chained to the ice, howling with a terrifying primal energy, were 116 elite Greenland sled dogs. The leader of this camp stepped forward to greet the stunned British sailors. He had a hard aquiline nose, eyes like chips of blue ice, and the ruthless, calculating demeanor of a man who had dedicated his entire existence to the mastery of the cold. It was Roald Amundsen. Amundsen was a phantom. He was not supposed to be in the southern hemisphere. For years, Amundsen had publicly declared that his life's ambition was to be the first man to reach the North Pole. He had raised funds, borrowed the Fram, and prepared for an Arctic voyage. But when American explorers Frederick Cook and Robert Peary both claimed to have reached the North Pole first, Amundsen's dream was crushed. So, in total secrecy, Amundsen changed his mind. He didn't tell his financial backers. He didn't tell the public. He didn't even tell his own crew until they were already out at sea. He simply turned his ship around and sailed south. As he left civilization, Amundsen had sent a brief, chillingly polite telegram to Captain Scott, which Scott had received just before leaving New Zealand. Beg leave to inform you, Fram proceeding Antarctic. Amundsen. Scott had known Amundsen was coming, but he had assumed the Norwegian would set up camp on the opposite side of the continent, thousands of miles away. It was an unspoken gentleman's agreement. The Antarctic was massive. There was no need to crowd each other. But Amundsen was not a gentleman. He was a professional. He had not come to the Antarctic to conduct science. He had not come to map glaciers or collect penguin eggs or study the magnetic fields. He had come to win a race. By setting up his base in the Bay of Whales, Amundsen was camped a full 60 miles closer to the South Pole than Scott was. When the letter detailing this encounter was handed to Scott in the smoky, crowded interior of the Cape Evans hut, the psychological landscape of the expedition instantly violently shifted. The isolation that had felt so heavy just weeks before was now gone. They were no longer alone in the void. There was a predator on the ice with them. The horror of Amundsen's presence was not just that he was a rival, it was how perfectly adapted he was. Campbell's letter described the Norwegian camp with a sense of awe and creeping dread. The British were struggling to keep their ponies alive in the snow. Amundsen's dogs were thriving, sleeping outside in the blizzards, eager to run. The British were sinking to their knees, dragging heavy sledges by the strength of their own backs. The Norwegians were gliding silently over the surface on skis, letting the dogs do the work. Amundsen's strategy was brutally simple, born from years of living with the Inuit in the Arctic. He would use the dogs to pull the sledges. When the sledges grew lighter as they ate the food, he would kill the weakest dogs and feed them to the remaining dogs and to the men. He would literally consume his own transport to reach the pole. It was a ruthless, mathematically perfect equation of survival and speed. Scott, burdened by British sentimentality and naval tradition, found the idea of eating his own dogs abhorrent. He intended to rely on the dying ponies and the breaking backs of his men. As the sun began to dip, below the horizon, signaling the start of the 4-month Antarctic night, the men in the wooden hut looked at their captain. The scientific expedition was over. The quest for knowledge was dead. It had been replaced by a suffocating high-stakes sprint for glory. If they lost this race, all their suffering, all the millions of pounds spent, all the agony of the frostbite and the isolation would be for nothing. They would be a footnote in history. The pressure on Scott became an invisible physical weight, heavier than the ice itself. Outside the thin wooden walls of the hut, the wind began to shriek, rising to a terrifying sustained howl of 60 miles per hour. The temperature plummeted to 40 below zero. The sun vanished, leaving only a cold, indifferent darkness. They were trapped for the winter, and somewhere out there in the blackness, just 400 miles across the frozen sea, the Phantom was waiting for the dawn. Chapter 3. The Long Night, on April 23, 1911, the sun touched the northern horizon of the Antarctic ice, lingered for a few hours in a bruised, bloody display of violet and crimson, and then slipped away. It would not rise again for 120 days. To understand the psychological crucible of the Terra Nova Expedition, you must first understand the reality of the polar night. We are accustomed to darkness as a temporary state, a brief intermission between days that is broken by the flick of a light switch or the glow of a street lamp. But the Antarctic winter night is not an intermission. It is an epoch. It is a suffocating physical weight that descends upon the world and slowly, methodically, begins to crush the minds of the men trapped beneath it. When the sun vanished, the geography of Cape Evans underwent a violent transformation. The temperature plummeted with a terrifying speed, plunging to 40, 50, and then 60 degrees below zero. The ocean itself, the vast churning Ross Sea that had carried them to the edge of the continent, froze solid, expanding outward for hundreds of miles. The water turned into a chaotic, tortured landscape of pressure ridges, massive, jagged blocks of blue ice pushed up into the black sky by the unimaginable force of the freezing sea. And then came the wind. It was not the wind of a terrestrial storm. It was a primeval, shrieking force that poured down from the high polar plateau, a constant howling gale that regularly exceeded 70 miles per hour. It picked up the dry, crystalline snow and whipped it across the ice with such ferocity that stepping outside felt like being sandblasted with broken glass. Against this apocalyptic environment, the only defense was a single wooden box. The Cape Evans hut was 50 feet long and 25 feet wide. Inside this fragile seaweed-insulated structure lived 33 men. They were the shore party, the core of the expedition, left behind when the Terra Nova sailed north to escape the freezing ocean. For 4 months, this single room would be their entire universe. The sensory experience of the hut was an assault. The structure was heated by a large stove that burned the blubber of Weddell seals. It was a highly efficient fuel, but it produced a thick, greasy black smoke that coated the walls, the ceiling, and the men's skin in a layer of oily soot. The air was perpetually thick with the smell of unwashed wool, rendering fat, wet dog fur, and the unventilated exhalations of 36 men. Because the temperature outside was so extreme, the walls of the hut became a battleground between the heat of the stove and the lethal cold of the continent. The moisture from the men's breath and the cooking pots would hit the wooden walls and instantly freeze. A thick layer of solid white ice began to slowly creep up the interior walls of the hut, a constant physical reminder that the void was trying to get in. In this claustrophobic, reeking environment, Captain Robert Falcon Scott faced his most dangerous enemy yet, madness. Cabin fever in the Antarctic is not merely a feeling of restlessness. It is a profound, corrosive paranoia that eats away at the bonds of a team. When men are trapped together in a small space with the constant threat of death looming just beyond the door, tiny grievances magnify into consuming hatreds. The sound of a man chewing his food, the way someone breathes in their sleep, a perceived slight over a card game. These microscopic irritations can quickly unravel the sanity of a camp. Scott understood this deeply. He knew that if the discipline broke down, the expedition would collapse before they ever took a single step toward the pole. His defense mechanism against the encroaching madness was uniquely, almost absurdly, British. He enforced an ironclad routine of naval discipline and Victorian etiquette. Inside the tiny wooden box, Scott maintained a strict class divide. A wall of wooden packing crates physically separated the officers and scientists in the wardroom from the seamen and support staff in the mess deck. They ate at different tables. They maintained rigid naval protocol. But Scott went further than just military discipline. He created a university at the end of the world. He commanded that the men give formal academic lectures 3 nights a week. In the heart of the howling darkness, while the wind threatened to tear the roof from the hut, the men would sit in the dim, smoky light of the blubber lamps and listen to highly technical, hour-long presentations on the parasitology of penguins, the geological strata of the transantarctic mountains, or the physics of ice crystal formation. They published a typed newspaper, the South Polar Times, filled with poetry, intricate illustrations, and inside jokes. They celebrated Midwinter Day with a massive feast, hanging makeshift decorations, toasting the king, and singing songs around the piano they had incredibly managed to drag across the ice. From the outside, it looks like a scene of aristocratic absurdity. Men dressed in soot-stained wool, eating seal meat, pretending they are sitting in a lecture hall in London. But it was not absurdity. It was a desperate, calculated survival tactic. Scott was building a fortress of civilization to hold back the primal terror of the dark. By forcing the men to focus on science, on routine, on the polite rules of Edwardian society, he kept their minds tethered to reality. He gave them no empty hours in which to sit and listen to the wind, or to contemplate the 800-mile march of death that awaited them in the spring. But even within this rigid fortress of sanity, the sheer obsessive madness of the era could not be entirely contained, and nothing illustrates the dark reality of the Terra Nova Expedition quite like the events of late June, right in the dead center of the Antarctic winter. This event is known to history as the Winter Journey. To the men who survived it, it was known simply as the worst journey in the world. The expedition's chief scientist, Dr. Edward Wilson, was obsessed with emperor penguins. He believed that the embryo of the emperor penguin held the evolutionary missing link between dinosaurs and birds. But there was a catch. Emperor penguins are the only birds on Earth that breed during the absolute darkest, coldest depths of the Antarctic winter. To get the eggs, Wilson proposed a mission that bordered on suicidal insanity. He wanted to take a team of 3 men, leave the safety of the Cape Evans hut, and walk 60 miles across the frozen sea to a penguin rookery at Cape Crozier. They would have to make this journey in the total, permanent pitch black of the polar night, dragging their own sledges, navigating by the stars, in temperatures that no human being had ever endured. Scott, prioritizing science alongside the conquest of the pole, agreed. On June 27th, Dr. Wilson, Lieutenant Henry Birdie Bowers, and a young wealthy civilian named Apsley, Cherry Garrod, strapped themselves into their hauling harnesses. They waved goodbye to the men at the hut and walked out into the endless howling blackness. What followed was a descent into a physical hell that is almost impossible to comprehend. The temperature dropped immediately to 60 degrees below zero and then kept falling. At its lowest point, the thermometer recorded negative 77 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, the air itself becomes a weapon. Every breath feels like swallowing razor blades as the cold sears the lungs. In the absolute darkness, they stumbled blindly over the shattered pressure ridges of the sea ice. They fell constantly, bruising their knees and ribs against blocks of ice they could not see. Because the snow at that temperature loses all its moisture, it stops acting like snow and begins to act like dry desert sand. The metal runners of their sledge ground to a halt. The 3 men had to throw their entire body weight against the harnesses just to move the sledge a few inches at a time, screaming in exertion in the dark. The physical toll of the cold was grotesque. As they strained and pulled, their bodies produced sweat. But in the negative 70-degree air, that sweat instantly froze inside their clothing. Their heavy wool garments turned into rigid, impenetrable suits of ice armor. When they stopped to rest, their clothes froze solid in the exact position they were standing. To move again, they had to physically break the ice joints of their own clothing. But the true nightmare began when it was time to sleep. They carried reindeer skin sleeping bags. During the day, the moisture from their sweat and the damp air permeated the fur, and by the time they pitched their flimsy canvas tent, the sleeping bags were frozen as hard as cast iron. They resembled massive 60-pound wooden logs. To get inside, the men had to pry the frozen lips of the bags open with their frostbitten fingers, forcing themselves into the narrow, icy tubes. It took over an hour of violent, agonizing shivering for their body heat to thaw the fur just enough to mold around them. Cherry Garrard later wrote that his teeth chattered with such violent, uncontrollable force that he actually shattered several of them in his own mouth. They lay in the darkness, side by side, listening to the ice crack and groan beneath them, completely paralyzed by the freezing wet fur, unable to sleep, only waiting for the hours to pass so they could resume the torture of walking. They pushed forward through the pitch-black void for 3 weeks. Their skin was covered in weeping frostbite blisters. Their minds began to hallucinate in the sensory deprivation of the darkness. Yet incredibly, they reached Cape Crozier. They found the emperor penguins huddling in the howling blizzard, and they collected 5 eggs. But the continent was not done with them. As they built a makeshift rock igloo on the cliffs of Cape Crozier to ride out a sudden ferocious hurricane, the wind reached force 11. The storm hit with the concussive force of an exploding bomb. It tore the canvas roof off their rock shelter, exposing them directly to the blizzard. And then the ultimate disaster struck. The wind caught their primary canvas tent, which had been pitched nearby, ripped it from its moorings, and blew it away into the blackness of the ocean. To lose your tent in the Antarctic winter is a death sentence. Without the thin layer of canvas to trap a fraction of their body heat, they would freeze solid in a matter of hours. The 3 men lay in their frozen sleeping bags on the hard rock, buried under the drifting snow, staring up into the screaming darkness. They had no food, no shelter, and no hope. The temperature was 60 below zero. They knew they were dead. In a staggering display of psychological endurance, they did not panic. They did not turn on each other, lying in the dark, waiting for the cold to stop. Their hearts, Wilson, Bowers, and Cherry Garrard, began to sing. They sang hymns and old-school songs. their voices thin and reedy over the roar of the hurricane, holding on to the very last threads of their humanity in the face of absolute, indifferent annihilation. For 2 days and 2 nights, the storm raged over them. They lay completely buried in the snowdrift. When the wind finally broke, they crawled out of their frozen tombs, half dead, their bodies starved and battered. In a miraculous stroke of luck that defies all probability, Bowers spotted a dark shape about half a mile away on the ice. The storm had dropped their tent. Weeping with relief, they recovered the canvas, packed their sledge, and began the agonizing 60-mile march back to Cape Evans. When they finally stumbled through the doors of the wooden hut in early August, the men inside stared at them in horror. The 3 explorers looked like ancient weathered gargoyles. Their clothes were fused to their bodies in solid blocks of dirty ice. Their faces were black with soot, scarred by deep weeping frostbite wounds, their eyes sunken and hollow. They had been gone for 5 weeks in the absolute dark. They handed over the penguin eggs. Science had been served. But the winter journey had proven a terrifying point. It had shown, with brutal clarity, just how quickly the Antarctic environment could reduce strong, capable men to the brink of death. It had demonstrated that the margins for error in this place were exactly 0. As Cherry Garrard slowly thawed out his frozen, shattered body by the blubber stove, the calendar turned to late August. The sky to the north began to bleed a pale, watery grey. The long night was finally ending. The sun was coming back. Inside the hut, the atmosphere shifted. The relief of the approaching daylight was instantly smothered by a new suffocating weight. For 4 months, the darkness had been an excuse. They couldn't move. They couldn't march. They were safe, in their wooden box, insulated from reality by their lectures and their routines. But with the sun came the truth. The 800-mile march to the South Pole was no longer a theoretical exercise sketched out on a map in the wardroom. It was a physical reality waiting just beyond the door. Captain Scott sat at his small wooden desk, writing furiously in his diary by the light of a flickering lamp. He was projecting an aura of supreme confidence to his men, but in his private thoughts, the creeping dread was taking hold. He knew the ponies were weak and unsuited for the deep snow. He knew the remaining motor sledges were temperamental and unproven in the extreme cold. He knew the calorie deficit of dragging the heavy wooden sledges themselves would slowly consume his men's bodies. And worse than all of the physical obstacles, a psychological shadow hung over the entire camp. Just 400 miles across the ice, Roald Amundsen and his team of ruthless Norwegians were watching the exact same sunrise. Amundsen had 100 healthy, perfectly adapted dogs. He had lightweight sledges. He had the ruthless efficiency of a man who viewed the Antarctic not as a scientific laboratory, but as a racetrack. The trap was fully set. The pieces were on the board. The sun crested the horizon, painting the frozen sea in a brilliant, blinding light. The men of the Terra Nova Expedition stepped out of the wooden hut, blinking in the glare, and looked south toward the infinite white horizon. They were about to begin the worst journey in the history of human exploration. The darkness had tried to break their minds, but the true horror, the physical, methodical destruction of their bodies, was only just about to begin. The race to the bottom of the earth was on, and it was a race that would require them to walk until there was absolutely nothing left. It is a season of cruel, blinding illumination. By late October of 1911, the sun had fully returned to the Ross Sea, climbing higher into the sky each day, casting a harsh, sterile glare over the endless expanse of the Great Ice Barrier. The 4 months of total darkness had ended, but the light did not bring warmth. It only revealed the sheer impossible scale of the prison they had built for themselves. The temperature still hovered at 20 to 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The wind still howled down from the polar plateau. But now there was nowhere to hide. The waiting was over. Inside the smoky, crowded walls of the Cape Evans hut, the atmosphere had shifted from the quiet endurance of winter to a frantic, nervous energy. Captain Robert Falcon Scott was mobilizing his army. The plan for the southern journey was a masterpiece of Edwardian logistical complexity. It was not a simple hike. It was a staggered, multi-tiered siege. To get 5 men to the South Pole and back, Scott had to deploy over a dozen men, horses, dogs, and machines to carry the thousands of pounds of food and fuel required just to support the final push. Teams would march out, drop their supplies at designated depots, and then turn back, leaving the core team to push further south. It was a pyramid of sacrifice, with Scott standing at the very top. The vanguard of this massive operation was the motor party. Scott's belief in the 3 experimental internal combustion motor sledges was absolute. They were supposed to be the mechanical saviors of the expedition, the heavy lifters that would spare the ponies, and the men from the back-breaking labor of hauling the massive supply loads across the first few hundred miles of the barrier. Having already lost the largest motor sledge to the freezing ocean through the sea ice months earlier, all of the expedition's mechanical hopes now rested on the 2 remaining machines. On October 24th, 1911, the heavy wooden doors of the Cape Evans hut swung open, and the silence of the Antarctic was shattered by the explosive, rattling roar of gasoline engines. The 2 motor sledges crawled out onto the ice. They were strange primitive beasts, clunky open-air chassis sitting atop heavy grooved metal tracks, completely unsuited for the delicate nuances of the polar environment. The men operating them, Lieutenant Edward Evans and the chief motor mechanic, Bernard Day, were bundled in heavy layers of reindeer fur and windproof canvas, their goggles completely obscuring their faces as they steered the rattling iron monsters directly south. For the first few hours, it felt like a triumph of human ingenuity. The engines coughed out thick plumes of black exhaust that stained the pristine white snow, leaving a trail of soot that could be seen for miles. They dragged massive trains of heavily loaded sledges behind them, moving at a slow but steady, walking pace. To the men watching them disappear into the white horizon, it seemed that technology had indeed conquered the ice. But the continent has a way of violently rejecting the things that do not belong to it. The Antarctic cold is not merely a temperature. It is an active, physical force that changes the molecular structure of the world. As the motor party pushed further out onto the Great Ice Barrier, the temperature plunged to minus 30 degrees. At this temperature, the internal mechanics of the Edwardian engines began to warp. The lubricating oil, meant to keep the metal parts moving smoothly, turned into a thick gelatinous glue. The rubber seals became as brittle as dry glass, shattering under the vibration. But the most fatal flaw was the design of the engine blocks themselves. As the machines roared over the uneven, hard-packed snow, the air-cooled cylinders began to overheat while the outer metal casings remained frozen. The extreme rapid fluctuations in temperature caused the cast iron engine blocks to violently contract and expand. 4 days into the journey, a loud, sharp crack echoed across the ice, followed by a terrifying, grinding screech of metal tearing itself apart. The first motor sledge died instantly. A cylinder had blown. The metal had simply fractured under the stress of the cold. Bernard Day, the mechanic, desperately tried to fix it. He worked with his bare hands in the sub-zero wind, because thick gloves made handling the delicate tools impossible. When human skin touches frozen metal at 30 below zero, the moisture on the skin instantly freezes to the iron. When the men pulled their hands away, they left patches of their own skin fused to the engine block, suffering agonizing, deep tissue cold burns. There was nothing they could do. The machine was dead. They abandoned the heavy chassis in the snow, a useless freezing monument to Edwardian arrogance, and transferred the massive load to the one surviving motor sledge. But the second machine was already dying. It groaned under the double weight, its engine sputtering and backfiring as it struggled against the deep, soft snowdrifts. The men had to constantly stop to heat the carburetor with a blowtorch just to keep the fuel from freezing solid in the lines. They fought for every single mile, the mechanical roar replaced by the desperate cursing of freezing men. Just a few days later, 50 miles from Cape Evans, the second engine let out a pathetic wheezing gasp, shuddered violently, and went silent. The big end of the connecting rod had smashed through the crankcase. The final motor sledge was dead. The sudden silence that fell over the great ice barrier was absolute. It was heavy, indifferent, and terrifying. For the men of the motor party, the death of the machines was not just a mechanical failure, it was a psychological catastrophe. They were staring at thousands of pounds of pemmican, hardtack biscuits, and paraffin oil, sitting on wooden sledges. Without the engines, this massive cargo still had to be moved south to supply Scott's main party, which was following days behind them with the ponies and the dogs. There was only one source of power left. Lieutenant Evans, Bernard Day, and the two other men in the motor party looked at the heavy canvas hauling harnesses. They strapped the thick webbing across their chests, leaned forward into the traces, and took the entire weight of the expedition onto their own shoulders. This was the beginning of the man-hauling, the brutal, grueling, soul-crushing reality that would define the rest of their lives. When Captain Scott and the main party caught up to the abandoned motor sledges a week later, passing the rusted, silent machines, half buried in the drifting snow, the visual evidence of their failure was impossible to ignore. Scott's grand, mechanized plan was in ruins. The ponies, struggling in the deep snow, were already beginning to fail. The dogs were functioning well, but Scott, adhering to his naval traditions, stubbornly planned to send them back early, refusing to rely on them for the final push. The math of their survival was suddenly changing. The burden of the journey was shifting rapidly from the animals and the machines directly onto the muscles, bones, and willpower of the men. To understand the specific horror of man-hauling in the Antarctic, you must understand the physics of the sledges and the terrain. They were pulling wooden sledges, 12 feet long, constructed of flexible ash wood and lashed together with leather thongs, so they could twist and bend over the uneven ground without snapping. Fully loaded with supplies, a single sledge could weigh upwards of 800 pounds. The terrain of the Great Ice Barrier was not a smooth, glassy skating rink. It was a hostile, chaotic desert. The relentless winds carved the hard-packed snow into severe undulating ridges known as sastrugi. These ridges were as hard as concrete, rising up like frozen waves, sometimes 2 to 3 feet high. Pulling a heavy sledge over sastrugi is like trying to drag a heavy wooden boat over a beach covered in sharp boulders. The sledge runners would catch on the crests of the frozen waves, violently jerking the men backward in their harnesses, wrenching their spines and tearing at their shoulder muscles. But the alternative to the hard sastrugi was even worse. When the wind dropped and the temperature plummeted into the -40s, the surface of the snow changed fundamentally. It lost all of its lubricating moisture. It ceased to be snow and became a dry, coarse, crystalline powder. The metal runners of the sledges no longer glided. Instead, they ground into the powder with immense friction. The men described it as dragging a heavy sled through dry beach sand. Every single step required a massive, agonizing expenditure of raw physical power. There was no momentum. If a man stopped pulling for even a fraction of a second, the sledge stopped dead. The daily routine became an endless loop of misery. They would wake up inside the frozen canvas tent to a temperature of 30 below zero. Their sleeping bags, damp with the frozen condensation of their own breath, were as hard as wood. The simple act of putting on their boots, stiff, frozen canvas finnesko, took up to an hour of agonizing effort, beating the frozen canvas with wooden mallets, just to force their battered, frost-bitten feet inside. They would eat a breakfast of thick, greasy pemmican hoosh, a dense stew made of dried beef powder and rendered fat, boiled over a small paraffin stove. It was incredibly dense in calories, designed to fuel a furnace, but it sat heavily in their stomachs. Then they would step outside into the blinding white glare. The sun reflecting off the endless expanse of snow was a weapon. Even with their dark goggles, the ultraviolet radiation burned their retinas. Snow blindness felt like having hot, crushed glass rubbed directly into the eyes. Men would weep in agony, their tears freezing to their cheeks, stumbling forward blindly in the harnesses, relying entirely on the man in front of them for direction. They would lean forward into the canvas traces, the heavy straps biting deep into their clavicles and rib cages, and they would pull, left foot, drag, left foot, right foot, drag. They did this for 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours a day. The physical exertion was so immense that, despite the sub-zero temperatures, they would sweat profusely beneath their heavy wool clothing. But when they stopped for even a moment to catch their breath, that sweat would instantly freeze, encasing their bodies in a shell of icy armor. The monotony of the march was psychologically corrosive. There were no landmarks, there were no trees, no rocks, no hills. There was only the flat, white horizon that never seemed to get any closer, and the vast, empty blue sky. Above, a man could walk for 10 hours, look over his shoulder, and see his own tracks leading back to a horizon that looked exactly the same as the one in front of him. The sensory deprivation caused their minds to wander into dark, obsessive loops. But the true invisible killer of the Terra Nova Expedition was not the cold, and it was not the wind. It was the mathematics of starvation. In the extreme cold, dragging hundreds of pounds of dead weight through deep snow, the human body acts like a blast furnace. To maintain its core temperature and fuel the massive muscular effort, a man needs to consume between 6,000 and 7,000 calories a day. Scott's meticulously planned rations, the pemmican, the hardtack biscuits, the butter and the cocoa, provided exactly 4,500 calories a day. It was a fatal miscalculation. Every single day they marched, they were running a massive caloric deficit. When the body does not get enough calories to fuel its exertion, it begins to consume itself. First, it burns through the subcutaneous fat, stripping the body of its natural insulation against the cold. The men began to feel the freezing temperatures more acutely. The cold penetrated straight to their bones. Once the fat was gone, the body turned to the muscles. It began to cannibalize the very fibers that were required to pull the sledges. Their legs grew heavy. Their arms lost their strength. Their faces became gaunt, their eyes sinking deep into their skulls, giving them the hollow, haunted look of the walking dead. They were quite literally marching themselves to death, burning their own bodies as fuel to cross the ice. As November bled into December, the march of doom ground relentlessly southward. The remaining ponies, starved and exhausted, sank deeper into the snow. The men, their harnesses cutting into their shrinking shoulders, grew silent, conserving every ounce of energy just to put one foot in front of the other, and, constantly, hanging over every agonizing step, was the phantom shadow of Roald Amundsen. Scott and his men knew that somewhere to the east, out of sight in the vast white void, the Norwegians were also moving south. They imagined Amundsen gliding effortlessly over the snow on his skis, pulled by his massive teams of healthy, ferocious dogs. Every time a sledge runner caught on the ice, every time a pony stumbled and fell in the drifts, the British could feel the race slipping away from them. The great ice barrier stretched out before them, an endless, indifferent white sea. They had left the safety of the hut behind. The machines were dead. The animals were dying. The only engines left were made of flesh and bone, and those engines were slowly, methodically destroying themselves with every mile. They were 400 miles from the pole. The true ascent, the nightmare of the Beardmore Glacier, had not even begun. But the trap was already closed, and the slow, grinding process of their annihilation was firmly underway. Chapter 5: The Slaughter in the Snow. To understand the tragedy of the Terra Nova Expedition, you must first understand the biology of a horse, and why it has absolutely no place at the bottom of the earth. Captain Robert Falcon. Scott's decision to rely on 19 white Manchurian ponies as the primary engine of his Antarctic siege is one of the most heavily debated, heavily criticized logistical choices in the history of exploration. Scott had seen dogs fail during his previous expedition, the Discovery, largely because his men did not understand how to drive them, feed them, or manage them. Scott, a product of the British Royal Navy, harbored a deep romanticized prejudice against the use of dogs. He believed that the noble, suffering labor of man, the act of hauling the sledges by the sheer force of human will, was inherently superior and more glorious than being pulled to the pole by animals. But he knew men alone could not carry the thousands of pounds of supplies across the great ice barrier. He needed heavy lifters for the first leg of the journey. He chose the Manchurian ponies because they were known to be incredibly hardy, bred in the freezing, unforgiving steppes of eastern Asia. They were strong, they were stubborn, and they could pull massive loads. But the steppes of Asia are not the Great Ice Barrier. The fatal flaw in Scott's plan was a matter of simple weight distribution and thermal biology. Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian phantom racing them to the pole, had brought over 100 Greenland sled dogs. A dog is biologically engineered for the snow. A dog's weight is distributed across 4 wide, padded paws, allowing it to glide over the fragile crust of the snowpack. Furthermore, a dog does not sweat through its skin. It regulates its body temperature by panting through its mouth. In the sub-zero temperatures of the Antarctic, a dog can run all day, pull a heavy load, and remain relatively dry, beneath its thick fur. A horse is an entirely different machine. A pony weighs roughly 800 pounds. All of that immense weight is concentrated on 4 small hard hooves. When the Manchurian ponies stepped onto the surface of the Great Ice Barrier, the fragile upper crust of the snow, hardened by the wind but hollow underneath, simply could not support them. With every single step, the crust shattered. The ponies would punch through the surface, plunging their legs into the soft, bottomless powder beneath, often sinking all the way up to their bellies. Imagine the sheer, agonizing terror of the animal. A horse is a prey species. Its instinct when trapped is to panic, to thrash, and to fight. As the ponies sank into the freezing snow, they would violently lunge forward, trying to pull their hooves out of the deep holes, only to shatter the crust again on the very next step and plunge back down into the freezing depths. They were dragging sledges that weighed 600 to 700 pounds, acting as dead anchors behind them. The men tried to save them. They had brought experimental snowshoes for the ponies, wide, circular wire and wood contraptions meant to strap onto their hooves to distribute their weight. But the snowshoes were clumsy. The ponies hated them, kicking them off or becoming hopelessly tangled in the straps. When the snowshoes did stay on, the snow would clump underneath them, forming massive heavy blocks of ice that the exhausted animals had to lift with every agonizing stride. And then there was the sweat. Because the ponies were exerting a gargantuan amount of physical effort, thrashing and lunging through the deep snowdrifts, their bodies heated up. Unlike dogs, horses sweat through their skin. In a temperate climate, this cools the animal. In the Antarctic, where the temperature hovered around 20 to 30 degrees below zero, it was a death sentence. The sweat would bloom on the ponies' coats, instantly reacting with the lethal cold air. Within minutes, the moisture would freeze. The white ponies were transformed into terrifying ghostly apparitions, entirely encased in a thick solid armor of ice. The ice matted their hair, froze their eyelashes shut, and locked their joints. When they stopped to rest, their body temperatures would plummet catastrophically. The man in charge of keeping these animals alive was Captain Lawrence Titus Oates. Oates was a cavalry officer, a veteran of the Boer War, and a man who understood horses better than anyone else on the expedition. He was a stoic, wealthy, classically trained British soldier who had actually paid for the privilege of joining the Terra Nova crew. He was tough, uncomplaining, and deeply, profoundly attached to the animals under his care. Watching the ponies suffer tore Oates apart. He knew long before the others that the animals were doomed. He recognized that the fodder Scott had brought for them was insufficient. He recognized that the environment was slowly killing them. Oates would spend hours after the agonizing daily marches desperately trying to keep the ponies alive. While the other men crawled into their frozen sleeping bags to escape the wind, Oates would stay out in the howling blizzard, using an ice axe to build massive walls of snow blocks to act as windbreaks for the shivering, ice-encased horses. He would rub their freezing legs, feed them the meager rations of oil cake out of his own hands, and talk to them in the dark. The men had given the ponies names, which only deepened the psychological torment of watching them die. There was Christopher, a violent, stubborn beast who fought the harness every morning. Victor, the strongest of the herd. Bones, a skeletal but resilient puller, and Jimmy Pig. They were not just livestock, they were members of the team, carrying the weight of the expedition's survival on their breaking backs. As November bled into December, the march southward became a slow motion. Slaughter. The rations for the ponies were running out. The animals were starving, burning through their own muscle mass to generate the heat needed to survive the nights. They grew hollow-eyed and lethargic. When a pony reached the point of absolute physical collapse, unable to take another step in the deep snow, the men were forced to make the grim decision. They would unhitch the exhausted animal from its sledge. They would lead it a short distance away from the camp, behind a wall of snow. And then Captain Oates would raise his service rifle. The sharp concussive crack of the gunshot was a violent intrusion into the silent white void of the Antarctic. It echoed flatly over the endless snow, a sound that made the remaining men flinch and look away. The bright, steaming red of the animal's blood, staining the pristine, sterile white of the great ice barrier, was a shocking visual violation. In a world entirely devoid of colour, the sudden appearance of deep crimson was a horrific reminder of their own biology, of the fragile, warm blood pumping through their own freezing veins. The death of a pony was not just an emotional blow, it was a brutal necessity of survival. The men would immediately descend upon the warm carcass with hunting knives and axes. They butchered the horses on the ice, harvesting the meat to feed the ravenous sled dogs, and reserving the best cuts for themselves. They were boiling horse meat in their pemmican hoosh, consuming the very animals they had walked beside for hundreds of miles, internalizing the energy of their fallen companions to fuel their own doomed march. By the first week of December, the Terra Nova Expedition was approaching the end of the Great Ice Barrier. The flat white horizon that had stretched out before them for over 400 miles finally gave way. Looming in the distance, rising like a jagged, impenetrable fortress wall against the sky, were the Trans-Antarctic Mountains. These were massive, black, volcanic peaks piercing through the continental ice sheet, standing as a physical barrier between the floating ice shelf and the high polar plateau. To reach the South Pole, they had to find a way up and over these mountains. The only path was the Beardmore Glacier. The Beardmore is one of the largest valley glaciers in the world. It is a 120-mile-long river of violently shattered, crevassed blue ice, plunging thousands of feet down from the plateau to the sea. From the bottom, looking up at its towering, cracked face, it looks less like a path and more like a frozen, vertical nightmare. Before they could begin the ascent, the Antarctic unleashed a final, devastating blow upon the remaining ponies. On December 4th, as they camped just a few miles from the base of the mountains, the sky turned a sickening, bruised shade of grey. The wind dropped entirely. The air became strangely, unnervingly warm, rising to the mid-30s Fahrenheit. And then it began to snow. It was not the dry, crystalline powder they were used to. It was a massive, wet, heavy blizzard. The flakes were huge, falling with a suffocating density that reduced visibility to absolute zero. The temperature anomaly was a disaster. Because the air was above freezing, the snow was wet. It melted as it hit their clothing, soaking through their supposedly windproof canvas and heavy wool. When the temperature inevitably dropped again a few hours later, that wet clothing froze solid, turning their garments into straitjackets of ice. The blizzard pinned them down for 4 agonizing days. The men lay in their damp, freezing sleeping bags, listening to the wet snow pile up against the thin canvas of their tents, threatening to bury them alive. But for the 5 remaining ponies, the blizzard was the final executioner. They stood outside, tethered behind their snow walls, without shelter, as the wet snow fell relentlessly upon them. The snow melted against their body heat, soaking them to the skin, and then froze into a thick, heavy shell. The animals stood in the blinding whiteout, shivering so violently that the ground beneath them seemed to vibrate. They had no food left. They had no strength left. They were simply waiting to die. When the storm finally broke on December 9th, the camp emerged from their tents into a world that had been buried in feet of soft, bottomless, wet snow. Scott looked at the 5 surviving ponies. They were skeletal, trembling, their heads hanging low to the ground. They looked like creatures dragged from a nightmare. Scott looked ahead to the base of the Beardmore Glacier, where the flat snow gave way to a steep, shattered incline of solid blue ice. The calculation was simple, brutal, and final. A horse cannot climb a vertical wall of cracked ice. They had reached the end of the line. The ponies could go no further. They named the campsite Shambles Camp. A shambles is an Old English word for a slaughterhouse. It was a grim, silent morning. The men unhitched the heavy wooden sledges for the last time. They led the 5 remaining ponies, including Oates's beloved Christopher, behind a large ridge of snow. The men retreated to their tents and covered their ears. 5 shots rang out across the frozen valley. 5 bright red stains blossomed on the perfect white snow. When Captain Oates returned to the tent, his face was unreadable. He was a soldier, and he had done his duty, but the men noted in their diaries that the light in his eyes had dimmed. The execution of the animals he had cared for, the animals he had sacrificed his own warmth and sleep to protect, took a profound psychological toll on him. He had watched the British Imperial machine fail, reduced to shooting starving horses in the snow. The butchery at Shambles Camp was extensive. The men cut the meat, stacking the frozen red blocks onto the sledges. They fed the remaining dogs a massive bloody feast. The camp looked like an abattoir, a horrific stain of death and desperation at the gateway to the mountains. But the true horror of Shambles Camp was not the death of the ponies. It was what their death signified. The machines were dead. The horses were dead. The dogs, according to Scott's plan, were to be sent back with the returning support parties in the coming days. Captain Robert Falcon Scott, Dr. Edward Wilson, Lieutenant Bowers, Petty Officer Edgar Evans, and Captain Lawrence Oates looked down at the massive 12-foot wooden sledges. They were loaded with hundreds of pounds of pemmican, biscuits, paraffin oil, sleeping bags, and tents. They were standing at the bottom of a 120-mile ramp of shattered, treacherous ice, leading up into a thin, freezing atmosphere where the temperature never rose above 0. They still had nearly 500 miles to go to reach the pole, and then 800 miles to walk back. There was no one left to pull. There were no engines left to start. The men picked up the heavy canvas, harnesses. They slipped the webbing over their heads, settling the thick, unyielding straps across their collarbones and their chests. They leaned their weight forward, feeling the crushing, dead resistance of the heavy sledges behind them. At Shambles Camp, the men ceased to be explorers. They ceased to be drivers. They became the beasts of burden. They had crossed a psychological and physical threshold from which there would be no return. They were about to begin the ascent of the Beardmore Glacier, hauling their own survival on their breaking backs, stepping over the frozen blood of their animals, and walking directly into the teeth of the continent. The slaughter in the snow was finished. The slaughter of the men was about to begin. Chapter 6. The Glass Mountain. To understand the sheer agonizing physical reality of the Beardmore Glacier, you must first discard any traditional concept of a mountain climb. When we imagine mountaineering, we picture men scaling sheer cliffs of grey rock, driving pitons into stone, and pulling themselves upward toward a distinct triangular peak. The Beardmore is not a mountain. It is a river of solid shattered ice, 120 miles long and 40 miles wide, pouring down through the trans-Antarctic mountains from the high polar plateau. It is one of the largest valley glaciers on the planet, a chaotic frozen waterfall moving at a glacial pace, violently cracking and tearing itself apart as it flows over the uneven bedrock beneath. For Captain Robert Falcon Scott and his remaining men, the Beardmore Glacier was a 120-mile staircase of glass, set at a treacherous, slippery incline, leading up to an altitude of 10,000 feet, and they had to drag thousands of pounds of dead weight up every single inch of it. They had left Shambles Camp behind. The carcasses of the ponies were freezing in the snow, a grim monument to the failure of their Edwardian logistics. The machines were rusted and dead on the great ice barrier. The dogs had been sent back to the coast with the first returning support party, adhering to Scott's stubborn, traditionalist plan. There was no external power left. There were no shortcuts. On the morning of December 10th, 1911, the remaining men strapped the heavy canvas-hauling harnesses across their chests, leaned their weight forward, and took their first steps up the glacier. The psychological threshold they crossed in that moment was profound. They were no longer directing the labor. They had become the labor. They were the beasts of burden now, willingly stepping into the traces. Almost immediately, the terrain of the continent violently changed its texture. The flat, relatively predictable snow of the barrier was replaced by the chaotic, tortured surface of the lower glacier. The ice here was a nightmare of pressure ridges and deep, soft, localized snowdrifts caused by the wind funneling through the mountain passes. The men found themselves sinking up to their knees in powder, while underneath the powder, the surface was slick, hard blue ice. They were pulling sledges that weighed over 800 pounds. When the runners of the sledges sank into the deep snow, they would act like anchors, coming to a dead, sickening halt. The men in the harnesses would be violently jerked backward, the thick canvas straps biting deep into their rib cages and collarbones, bruising the flesh right down to the bone. To get the sledges moving again, they had to coordinate their efforts, screaming on the count of 3, throwing their entire body weight forward in a synchronized, desperate lunge just to break the friction. They would gain a few feet, the sledge would sink again, and the agonizing process would repeat. They were fighting for literally every single yard of progress. The physical shock to their spines and their joints was catastrophic, and as the incline began to rise, the invisible silent killer of the expedition began to rapidly accelerate. Its work. That killer was starvation. The human body is an engine, and in the extreme cold, performing the most grueling physical labor imaginable, it operates like a blast furnace. To drag an 800-pound sledge up a glacier in sub-zero temperatures for 10 to 12 hours a day, a man requires upwards of 7,000 calories just to break even. Scott's meticulously planned rations, the dense pemmican hoosh, the hard-tack biscuits, the butter and the cocoa, provided exactly 4,500 calories a day. Every single time a man took a step up the Beardmore Glacier, he was operating at a massive, compounding caloric deficit. Because they were not putting enough fuel into the engine, their bodies had no choice but to begin consuming themselves. The biology of this starvation is a horrifying, creeping process. First, the body burns through the subcutaneous fat layer. This is the body's natural insulation against the cold. As the fat melted away, the men began to feel the freezing air with a new, terrifying intensity. The cold no longer just bit at their skin. It penetrated straight through to their bones, causing a deep, constant ache that no amount of wool clothing could stop. Once the fat was gone, the body turned to the muscles. It began to cannibalize the very fibers that were required to pull the sledges. The men's legs grew heavy and weak. Their arms lost their strength. Their faces transformed, taking on the gaunt, haunted, skeletal look of the walking dead. Their eyes sank deep into their skulls. They were quite literally burning themselves alive to stay warm, eating their own bodies from the inside out just to fuel the march. The psychological toll of this starvation was all-consuming. The men became obsessed with food. It dominated their waking thoughts and their freezing dreams. They would silently calculate the exact distribution of the biscuit crumbs. If one man's cup of hoosh seemed slightly fuller than another's, it sparked dark, irrational flashes of resentment. They were polite British officers, maintaining their Edwardian decorum, but beneath the surface, the primal biological panic of the starving animal was beginning to claw at their minds. Yet, despite the starvation and the agonizing labor, the Beardmore Glacier held a far more immediate, terrifying threat. As they climbed higher, the deep snow began to blow away, revealing the raw, blue ice of the glacier itself. And hidden within this ice were the crevasses. A crevasse is a deep open crack in the glacier, formed as the massive river of ice bends and shatters over the uneven rock beneath it. Some are only a few inches wide, others are massive, gaping chasms 50 feet across and hundreds of feet deep, plunging down into an abyss of absolute crushing darkness. The true horror of the crevasse field is that you rarely see them coming. The relentless Antarctic wind blows snow across the open cracks, forming fragile, suspended snow. Bridges that perfectly camouflage the drop. From the surface, the ground looks entirely solid. It is a minefield of trapdoors, waiting to swallow a man whole. Marching up the Beardmore meant walking into this minefield blind. A man would be leaning forward in his harness, pulling with all his remaining strength, his eyes fixed on the white ground ahead. He would take a step, and the solid earth would simply vanish beneath his boot. There was no sound, only the sudden stomach-dropping sensation of falling into the void. The thin crust of the snow bridge would shatter, and the man would plunge into the blue darkness. A split second later, the canvas-hauling harness would snap taut, arresting the fall with a violent bone-jarring jerk that knocked the wind out of his lungs. He would find himself dangling over the abyss, suspended by a single canvas strap. Looking down, the walls of the crevasse were smooth, polished blue ice, descending into an infinite, terrifying blackness. The cold radiating from the depths of the crack was profound, a stale, ancient chill that felt like the breath of a tomb. The silence down there was absolute. Above him, on the surface, his teammates would throw themselves flat onto the ice, driving their ice axes into the crust to anchor the sledge before it was dragged into the chasm by his weight. Then came the agonizing process of hauling the man out. In their starved, weakened state, pulling a 160-pound man in heavy clothing up over the lip of an ice cliff was an exhausting ordeal. They would haul on the ropes, their muscles screaming, their boots slipping on the sheer ice, until they dragged their companion over the edge, gasping and shivering. This did not happen just once. It happened constantly. Lieutenant Bowers fell into a crevasse and was left dangling, spinning slowly over the blue void. Petty Officer Edgar Evans, the giant of the expedition, fell repeatedly, his massive weight putting an incredible strain on his harness and his teammates. The psychological terror of this environment cannot be overstated. Every single step they took for weeks was a gamble with death. They could never relax. They could never trust the ground they walked on. The constant adrenaline-fueled shock of falling, combined with the physical exertion of hauling each other out, rapidly accelerated their physical decline. And as if the starvation, the exhaustion, and the crevasses were not enough, the environment deployed another weapon against them. The higher they climbed up the glacier, the thinner the atmosphere became. At 8,000 feet, the air was starved of oxygen. Every breath required a conscious, desperate heave of the lungs. The men were panting heavily, gasping for air that simply wasn't there, and drawing that negative 30-degree air rapidly into their lungs caused the moisture in their throats to freeze, leading to violent, agonizing coughing fits that left them dizzy and tasting blood. Furthermore, the thinning of the atmosphere meant there was less protection from the sun. The ultraviolet radiation beating down on the white expanse of the glacier was blindingly intense. This led to the agonizing affliction of snow blindness. Snow blindness is not simply a difficulty in seeing. It is a physical, ultraviolet burn on the cornea of the eye. It begins as a dull ache behind the eyes, a feeling of pressure in the skull. Then it escalates into a sharp, searing pain. The men described it as feeling like someone had thrown a handful of crushed glass beneath their eyelids. The eyes become incredibly sensitive to any light whatsoever, watering profusely, swelling shut, and throbbing with a sickening rhythm. To combat this, the men wore dark goggles, but the glare reflecting off the ice was so pervasive that it often bypassed the lenses. When a man went entirely snowblind, the treatment was barbaric but necessary. Dr. Edward Wilson would administer drops of zinc sulfate and a solution of cocaine directly into the affected eyes to numb the agonizing pain and then bandage the man's eyes completely shut. Imagine the sheer, surreal horror of this scenario. You are thousands of miles from civilization. You are starving. You are freezing. You are walking across a shattered glacier filled with bottomless, hidden trapdoors. And you are entirely blind. The snowblind men had to remain in their hauling harnesses, pulling their weight, with their eyes bandaged shut, completely trusting the man in front of them to guide their steps. They stumbled through the dark of their own ruined vision, waiting for the sudden, terrifying drop of the crevasse, their minds trapped in a state of suspended, agonizing anticipation. By late December, the Terra Nova Expedition was a battered, broken column of men. The initial military precision of the march had eroded into a grim, desperate stagger. They were covered in soot, their skin blackened by the sun and the frostbite, their lips cracked and bleeding, their beards matted with frozen spit and mucus. They fought their way up the final steepest terraces of the Beardmore Glacier. The sastrugi here were massive, frozen waves of ice that they had to literally lift the heavy sledges over by hand. The effort was superhuman, but there was no triumph in their movements, only a mechanical, dead-eyed persistence. Finally, as December drew to a close, the incline began to level out. The shattered, chaotic ice of the glacier gave way to a vast, flat, infinite expanse of white. They had reached the top. They were standing on the high polar plateau, 10,000 feet above sea level. They had conquered the Beardmore Glacier, surviving one of the most brutal geographical obstacles on the planet. But as Captain Scott looked at the men around him, he knew the devastating truth. The glacier had not killed them, but it had hollowed them out. It had taken the best of their strength, the reserves of their muscles, and the sharp edge of their willpower. They were standing on the roof of the world. They still had over 150 miles to march across the freezing, thin-aired plateau to reach the South Pole. And it was here, in this desolate, freezing wasteland, that Scott had to make the most agonizing, consequential decision of his life. He had to look at his starving, frostbitten, exhausted men and decide which of them he would take with him to the pole, and which of them he would send back to face the 800-mile march home alone. The trap was fully primed. The glass mountain had taken its toll, and the final fatal act of the Terra Nova tragedy was about to begin. Chapter 7. The Black Flag. When you climb a mountain in the normal world, the summit is a peak. It is a defined point where the earth falls away on all sides, and you know, with absolute physical certainty, that you have conquered it. You plant your flag, you take your breath, and you look down at the world below. The South Pole is not a peak. When Captain Robert Falcon Scott and his exhausted men finally dragged their heavy wooden sledges over the uppermost lip of the Beardmore Glacier in late December 1911, there was no summit waiting for them. There was no triumphant peak. Instead, the shattered, chaotic ice of the glacier simply leveled out into a terrifying, infinite expanse of flat white nothingness. They had reached the high polar plateau. They were standing at 10,000 feet above sea level, and they were stepping into a geographic anomaly that was actively designed to kill human beings. The Antarctic Plateau is a desert of ice. It is a vast, featureless dome covering the interior of the continent, larger than the United States, completely devoid of landmarks, wildlife, or variation. The horizon is a perfect, uninterrupted, 360-degree line separating the white ground from the pale blue sky. But the true horror of the plateau is the atmosphere. At 10,000 feet, the air is thin. Oxygen levels drop significantly. For a healthy person at rest, this altitude causes shortness of breath, dizziness, and a dull, throbbing headache. For starving men who have just spent 2 months dragging 800-pound sledges across a frozen continent, the altitude was a crushing physical blow. Every single breath required a conscious, desperate heave of the ribcage. The men were panting heavily, gasping for air that simply did not contain enough oxygen to fuel their failing muscles. Furthermore, the temperature on the plateau was perpetually brutal. It hovered steadily between -20 and -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Breathing this freezing, thin air directly into their lungs caused the moisture in their windpipes to crystallize. The men suffered from agonizing, violent fits of coughing that left them dizzy and tasting copper in the back of their throats. It was here, in this thin-aired, freezing void, 150 miles from the pole, that Scott had to make the most consequential and fatal logistical decision of the entire expedition. He had to choose his final team. The original plan, laid out years in advance in the warm, mahogany-panelled rooms of London, dictated that the final push to the pole would be made by a team of 4 men. Every single piece of equipment they had hauled up the glacier was mathematically calibrated for a 4-man unit. The canvas tent was cut and stitched to hold exactly 4 sleeping bags. The weekly ration bags were meticulously packed to feed 4 men for exactly 7 days. The cooking pots were sized to boil exactly enough pemmican hoosh for 4 men. On January 3rd, 1912, at a latitude of 87 degrees 32 minutes south, Scott ordered the final returning support party to halt. It was time to divide the men. 3 men would turn back and begin the long, dangerous journey home to the coast. The remaining team would push on to the pole. Scott looked at his men. They were all battered, soot-stained and starving. He selected Dr. Edward Wilson, his closest friend and the expedition's chief scientist. He selected Captain Lawrence Oates, the tough, silent cavalry officer who had watched his beloved ponies die. He selected Petty Officer Edgar Evans, the massive, broad-shouldered Welsh giant whom Scott believed was the strongest physical specimen on the ice. That was 4 men. That was the plan. The math was perfect. But then, staring into the white void, burdened by the crushing pressure of the race against the Norwegians, Scott made a decision that historians and survival experts still debate with a mixture of horror and bewilderment. He looked at Lieutenant Henry Birdie, Bowers, a short, incredibly resilient, relentlessly cheerful man who had survived the nightmare of the winter journey. Scott could not bring himself to leave Bowers behind. He felt he needed the extra manpower to pull the sledge, and he wanted Bowers's exceptional navigational skills for the final, precise calculations required to find the exact geographic bottom of the Earth. Scott ordered Bowers to join the polar party. He had chosen 5 men. In the normal world, adding 1 man to a hiking trip is a minor inconvenience. In the unforgiving mathematics of the Antarctic plateau, it was a logistical suicide pact. The immediate consequences were devastating. They had a tent built for 4 men. Now, 5 men in thick frozen reindeer skin sleeping bags had to cram themselves into it, overlapping their bodies, unable to turn over in the night without waking the entire exhausted crew. They had rations packed for 4 men, because Scott did not want to deplete the depots they were. Leaving behind for the return journey, the 5 men simply had to divide the 4-man rations into smaller portions. At the exact moment they needed maximum caloric intake to combat the altitude and the cold, Scott effectively cut their food supply by 20%. Cooking the food took longer, burning more of their precious paraffin fuel, because the pots were not designed for the volume needed for 5. But the most agonizing consequence fell squarely on the shoulders of Lieutenant Bowers himself. Because the plan was always for a 4-man final party, they had only brought 4 pairs of wooden skis to the top of the glacier. Scott, Wilson, Oates, and Evans strapped the long wooden boards to their boots, allowing them to glide over the soft, wind-blown snow of the plateau. Bowers had no skis. For the remaining 150 miles to the pole, while his 4 companions glided, Bowers had to walk. He was plunged into the deep, soft snow with every single step lifting, his heavy canvas boots out of the powder, throwing his weight against the hauling harness, matching the pace of men on skis through sheer, terrifying physical willpower. It was an expenditure of energy that defies human comprehension. On January 4th, the 3 men of the last support party, Lieutenant Teddy Evans, William Lashley, and Tom Crean, said their tearful goodbyes. They turned their sledge north and began the brutal descent back down the glacier. Scott, Wilson, Oates, Evans, and Bowers watched them go until they were swallowed by the white horizon. They were now the last 5 human beings at the bottom of the world. They turned south. The final march had begun. For the first week, the adrenaline of the approaching victory masked the accelerating decay of their bodies. They were making good time, covering 10 to 15 miles a day. The weather on the plateau, while brutally cold, was clear. The sun circled endlessly overhead, casting sharp, distinct shadows on the Sastrugi. Scott's diary entries from this period reveal a man hovering between agonizing physical pain and soaring imperial ambition. He was meticulously calculating their latitude every evening with his sextant, watching the degrees tick down. 88 degrees south, 89 degrees south. The geographic South Pole, 90 degrees south, was within their grasp. The spectre of Roald Amundsen and the Norwegians still haunted them, but as the days passed and the snow remained unbroken, a fragile, desperate hope began to bloom inside the British tent. Surely, if Amundsen had beaten them, they would have seen his tracks by now. All the suffering, the frozen ponies, the lost machines, the crevasses, the endless grinding starvation, it was all going to be worth it. They were going to win. They were going to plant the Union Jack at the absolute bottom of the earth. On the morning of January 16th, 1912, the 5 men woke up in their cramped, frozen tent. The calculation was clear. They were less than 15 miles from the pole. They would reach it the next day. They strapped on their harnesses. Bowers plunged his boots into the snow. They leaned forward and began to pull. The mood was lighter than it had been in months. They were laughing. They were talking about home, about the lectures they would give in London, about the hot baths, and the warm food waiting for them at the end of the world. At roughly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun was bright, creating a blinding glare off the ice. Lieutenant Bowers, walking on foot, pulling at the front of the sledge, stopped. He narrowed his eyes, peering through his dark, snow-encrusted goggles. Ahead of them, perhaps 2 miles in the distance, standing out against the perfect, infinite white of the horizon, was a tiny, anomalous speck of black. In the Antarctic interior, there is nothing black. There is only white snow and blue sky. A black speck is a biological and geological impossibility. The sledge ground to a halt. The 5 men stood in the harnesses, the freezing wind whipping the canvas around their legs, staring at the speck. At first, they tried to rationalize it. Scott suggested it was merely a trick of the light, a shadow cast by an unusually tall sastrugus ridge. But as they stood there, their hearts hammering against their ribs in the thin air, the horrible, crushing truth began to seep into their bones. They did not speak. They simply leaned into the harnesses and marched toward it. As they closed the distance, the black speck began to take shape. It was not a shadow. It was not a rock. It was a piece of black fabric tied to the splintered bearer of a wooden sledge, planted firmly in the hard snow. And surrounding the flag, deeply pressed into the pristine white surface of the plateau, were the undeniable chaotic tracks of dozens of dogs. The Norwegians had been here. The psychological devastation of that moment cannot be accurately captured in words. It was a physical blow. The adrenaline that had fueled their starving, broken bodies for the last 800 miles evaporated in a single second. It was instantly replaced by a cold, heavy, paralyzing despair. They unharnessed themselves and walked among the dog tracks in a daze. The prints were sharp and clear. They found the remains of a Norwegian camp. They found the paw prints of the animals Scott had refused to rely on. They found the ski tracks of men who had not dragged their own sledges, but had glided over the ice, pulled by the ferocious energy of their well-fed beasts. Captain Scott pulled out his diary. His handwriting, usually sharp and disciplined, betrayed the utter collapse of his spirit. "The worst has happened, or nearly the worst," Scott wrote that night. "All the daydreams must go. It will be a wearisome return." But the true final humiliation was waiting for them the next morning. On January 17th, 1912, they broke camp and marched the final few miles to the exact mathematical point of 90 degrees south. They were walking like zombies, their heads bowed, their eyes fixed on the snow. When they reached the pole, they found the monument to their defeat. Standing in the center of the vast white plain was a small brown canvas tent. It was pitched perfectly, a symbol of professional, effortless survival. Above the tent, snapping violently in the freezing wind, was the red and blue flag of Norway. Amundsen had named the camp Polheim, home at the pole. The British team approached the tent slowly, as if approaching a tomb. They pulled open the canvas flap and looked inside. The Norwegians had left items behind. There were reindeer fur sleeping bags, a sextant, spare boots, and heavily insulated mittens. These items were discarded not out of haste, but out of the sheer, terrifying confidence of a team that had so much excess gear and energy that they simply didn't need to carry it back. It was a silent testament to how completely Amundsen had mastered the environment that was currently killing the British. But sitting in the center of the tent was something much worse than discarded gear. It was a piece of paper. It was a letter addressed to King Haakon VII of Norway. And lying next to it was a polite brief note from Roald Amundsen addressed to Captain Scott. In the note, Amundsen requested that Scott, as the second party to reach the pole, kindly deliver the letter to the King of Norway, just in case Amundsen and his men perished on the way back to the coast. It was the ultimate inescapable insult. Amundsen was using Scott as his postman. He was using the British Empire's grandest, most expensive expedition as an insurance policy to verify his own victory. The air was 32 degrees below zero. The wind was howling. The 5 men stood outside the Norwegian tent, surrounded by 1,000 miles of deadly ice in every direction. The goal that had consumed their lives, the prize that they had sacrificed their ponies, their machines, and their own bodies to attain, was gone. Scott opened his diary. His hands were shaking from the cold and the shock. The words he wrote that day remain some of the most haunting ever put to paper in the history of human exploration. The pole. Yes, but under very different circumstances from those expected. Great God, this is an awful place and terrible enough for us to have laboured to it without the reward of priority. Well, it is something to have got here. Before they left, they had to perform the final, hollow ritual of their duty. They built a small cairn of snow. They planted the Union Jack, the flag looking incredibly small and insignificant next to the Norwegian tent. And then they took a photograph. If you look at this photograph today, you are looking at the faces of dead men. The 5 of them are standing in front of the flag. Their faces are blackened by frostbite and soot. Their eyes are dark, sunken pits of exhaustion. Captain Oates sits on the snow, his shoulders slumped, staring blankly ahead, looking like a man whose soul has already vacated his body. Petty Officer Evans, the giant, looks confused and battered. Scott sits in the center, his face drawn tight over his skull, pulling the trigger string of the camera. There is no triumph in the image. There is only the grim realization of the math that now faced them. The race was over. They had lost. But the true horror of the Terra Nova Expedition was that the South Pole was only the halfway point. The adrenaline that had kept them moving forward, the hope of glory that had acted as a phantom fuel for their starving muscles, was completely gone. The psychological fire had been extinguished. Now they had to turn around. They were 800 miles from the warmth of the wooden hut at Cape Evans. They were standing at an altitude of 10,000 feet. The Antarctic summer was already ending, and the temperatures were about to drop into a lethal, plunging spiral. They were starving, they were frostbitten, and they were utterly broken. Scott put his camera away. He looked north, toward the infinite white horizon they had just crossed. "Now for the run home," he wrote, "and a desperate struggle it will be. I wonder if we can do it." They strapped the canvas harnesses back across their chests. They leaned their weight into the heavy sledges, and they took their first steps away from the black flag, beginning the longest, most agonizing funeral march in human history. Chapter 8. The Fall of the Giant. There is a specific suffocating psychological terror that comes from standing at the absolute end of the line, looking over your shoulder, and realizing that every single agonizing, life-draining step you just took to get there must now be taken again in reverse. On January 18, 1912, Captain Robert Falcon Scott, Dr. Edward Wilson, Lieutenant Henry Bowers, Captain Lawrence Oates, and Petty Officer Edgar Evans turned their backs on the Norwegian flag flapping violently in the polar wind. They had reached the geographical South Pole, and it had tasted like ash. For the last 800 miles, they had been propelled forward by a phantom engine, the adrenaline of the race, the pursuit of imperial glory, the desperate, blinding hope that they would be the first. That engine was now completely dead. The psychological fire had been extinguished, leaving behind only the cold, brutal mathematics of their physical reality. They were 800 miles from the wooden hut at Cape Evans. They were standing at an altitude of 10,000 feet on the high polar plateau. The brief Antarctic summer had already peaked, and the brief window of warmth was slamming shut. They were starving, they were profoundly frostbitten, and they had to walk home. The first few days of the return march across the plateau introduced a new chaotic element to their suffering. On the way to the pole, the relentless freezing wind had been in their faces, acting as a physical wall they had to push through. Now, the wind was at their backs. To take advantage of this, they rigged a makeshift canvas sail to the heavy wooden sledge, hoping the wind would catch the fabric and help push the massive weight over the snow. In theory, it was a brilliant adaptation. In reality, it was a mechanical nightmare. The surface of the plateau was not a smooth expanse of ice. It was heavily corrugated with sastrugi, massive asymmetrical ridges of hard-packed snow that rose like frozen cresting waves, sometimes 2 to 3 feet high. With the sail deployed, the 800-pound sledge became a wild, unpredictable battering ram. The wind would catch the canvas, propelling the sledge forward at a terrifying speed, only for the runners to violently strike a ridge of sastrugi. The sledge would careen sideways, capsizing and dragging the men backward in their harnesses, violently wrenching their spines and smashing the heavy wooden framing into their bruised, emaciated legs. They were being physically beaten by their own survival equipment, but the bruises on their legs were revealing a far more insidious, invisible killer that had finally taken root inside their bodies. That killer was scurvy. To understand the specific horror of scurvy, you must understand that it is not merely a disease. It is the fundamental biological unspooling of the human body. Vitamin C is essential for the production of collagen, the protein that acts as the biological glue holding the body's tissues, blood vessels, and bones together. Without it, the body literally begins to fall apart at the cellular level. Scott's men had been living on a diet of dried pemmican and hardtack biscuits for months. They had consumed almost no fresh food. Their vitamin C levels were functionally zero. The symptoms began subtly. The men noticed that the heavy canvas-hauling harnesses, which dug deeply into their shoulders and chests for 12 hours a day, were leaving deep purple contusions that simply refused to heal. Instead of fading, the bruises spread, turning a sickening, necrotic black. Their gums began to swell and bleed, turning spongy and agonizingly sensitive to the freezing air they were gasping into their lungs. But the most terrifying consequence of the scurvy fell upon the strongest man in the team, Petty Officer Edgar Evans. Evans was the giant of the expedition. He was a broad-shouldered, barrel-chested Welshman, renowned in the Royal Navy for his immense physical power. Throughout the entire journey, he had been the anchor of the hauling team, throwing his massive weight against the traces to break the sledge free from the deep snow. But in the unforgiving mathematics of the Antarctic, immense size is a fatal liability. A large, heavily muscled engine requires a massive amount of fuel. Because Scott had packed the rations uniformly, Evans was eating the exact same amount of pemmican as Lieutenant Bowers, a man nearly half his size. Consequently, Evans was operating at a much steeper caloric deficit. His body was cannibalizing its own muscle tissue at a terrifying rate. The giant was starving the fastest. The catalyst for his downfall was seemingly microscopic. While tightening the frozen leather lashings on the sledge in the freezing wind, Evans's hand slipped. He suffered a deep cut on his finger. In the warm, bacteria-rich environment of London, it would have been a minor annoyance. A bandage, a few days of rest, and the body would repair the tissue. But on the polar plateau, with his collagen production completely halted by the scurvy, Evans's body could not knit the flesh back together. The cut remained an open weeping wound. Because the temperature hovered at 30 below zero, the exposed tissue was repeatedly frostbitten. The wound festered, turning a sickly gangrenous green and black. His entire hand swelled to twice its normal size, the skin pulled taut and shining with infected fluid. The pain was blinding, a constant throbbing, agony that radiated up his arm and directly into his central nervous system. His fingernails began to detach from the nail beds, yet he could not stop. He had to keep his swollen, rotting hand firmly wrapped around the hauling harness, pulling his share of the weight, because if he stopped, all 5 of them would die. By the first week of February, the temperature on the plateau had plummeted further. They were approaching the uppermost lip of the Beardmore Glacier, desperately trying to navigate from one tiny supply depot to the next. These depots, marked only by a single bamboo pole and a small black flag, were practically invisible in the vast, featureless desert. Missing a depot meant absolute starvation. They wandered in blinding blizzards, their hearts hammering in the thin air, terrified that they had walked past their only lifeline. When they miraculously found the Mount Darwin depot at the top of the glacier on February 7th, a new, devastating mechanical failure revealed itself. They dug out the tin cans of paraffin oil, which they desperately needed to fuel their small Primus stoves. They needed the stoves to melt the ice for drinking water and to boil their pemmican hoosh. But when they lifted the tins, they were terrifyingly light. The cans were sealed with small leather washers. In the extreme, prolonged cold of the ice shelf, the leather had shrunk and cracked. The highly volatile paraffin oil had slowly evaporated right through the failing seals, vanishing into the dry Antarctic air. They were catastrophically short on fuel. This meant they could not melt enough ice. They were suddenly plunged into severe dehydration, their mouths dry and cracked, their tongues swelling in their throats. It also meant they could not afford the fuel to heat their evening meals fully. They were eating their pemmican lukewarm, the rendered fat congealing into thick, greasy lumps that sat heavily in their starving stomachs, providing little warmth to their freezing cores. It was in this wretched, broken state that they stepped off the edge of the plateau and began the 120-mile descent down the Beardmore Glacier. If climbing the glass mountain had been an agonizing test of endurance, descending it was a chaotic, high-speed nightmare. The glacier was a steep, jagged ramp of solid, polished blue ice, riddled with bottomless crevasses. Because they were going downhill, the heavy sledge no longer acted as a dead weight they had to pull. It became a lethal projectile trying to run them over. They had to wear heavy iron crampons strapped to their frozen canvas boots, just to find purchase on the sheer ice. The men in the harnesses had to throw their weight backward, desperately braking against the momentum of the 800-pound sledge as it careened down the slopes. Their ankles, weakened by starvation and scurvy, rolled and twisted violently on the uneven ice. They were slipping, falling heavily onto the hard blue glass, bruising their hips and shattering the scabs on their unhealed wounds. And then came the crevasses. Descending the glacier meant navigating the labyrinth of hidden cracks at an accelerated, uncontrolled pace. The snow bridges that covered the chasms were weaker now, eroded by the summer sun. Edgar Evans, his mind clouded by the agonizing pain in his rotting hand, his massive body starved and exhausted, began to lose his footing. He fell into a crevasse. The thin crust shattered beneath his boots, and he dropped into the blue abyss. The canvas harness snapped taut with a violent jerk, catching his massive weight, but the shock of the fall was catastrophic. He swung over the bottomless dark, his head smashing violently against the hard, overhanging wall of the ice cliff. The other 4 men frantically drove their ice axes into the surface, screaming in exertion as they hauled the giant back up over the lip. When they dragged Evans onto the flat ice, he was changed. He had suffered a severe concussion. In a modern medical setting, a severe concussion requires immediate immobilization, darkness, and intensive care to monitor the swelling of the brain inside the skull. Edgar Evans received none of this. He was given a few minutes to catch his breath in a temperature of 20 below zero, and then he was ordered to stand up, strap the heavy canvas harness back across his bleeding chest, and continue dragging the sledge down a jagged mountain of ice. The brain swelling had nowhere to go. It began to press against his skull, slowly crushing his neurological functions. The physical deterioration of the giant rapidly transformed into a terrifying psychological unraveling. Evans stopped talking. The normally boisterous, cheerful Welshman descended into a grim, hollow-eyed silence. He began to drop his gear, leaving essential items behind in the snow without realizing it. He would stumble and fall on flat ice, his legs simply refusing to obey the signals from his damaged brain. But the most chilling sign of his impending death was his behavior with his clothing. The temperature was hovering near -30. The wind was howling down the glacier, biting through their heavy wool. Yet, the men would turn around to check on Evans and find that he had taken his heavy reindeer fur mittens off. He was walking with his bare hands exposed to the lethal cold, his frostbitten, necrotic skin freezing solid. This behavior, paradoxical undressing and a complete loss of self-preservation instincts, is a hallmark of profound hypothermia and severe traumatic brain injury. His mind was shutting down the peripheral systems to protect the core, but the core was already dying. He had regressed to the state of a confused, terrified child, trapped in the body of a dying giant. Captain Scott watched his strongest man disintegrate with a mounting sense of horror. The military cohesion of the unit was breaking. The polite Edwardian facade was cracking under the weight of the ice. They were no longer explorers. They were pallbearers, dragging a walking corpse toward the bottom of the glacier. By February 16th, they had reached the lower reaches of the Beardmore. The chaotic, shattered ice was giving way to the flatter, rolling slopes near the base of the mountains. But the weather had turned violently against them. The air was thick with driving snow, reducing visibility to a few feet. On the morning of February 17th, Evans looked terrible. His face was a mask of blackened, frostbitten flesh. His eyes were wild, unfocused, darting around the white void as if he were seeing phantoms in the blizzard. They strapped on the harnesses and began the march. Almost immediately, Evans's boots began to slip. The crampons detached from his frozen canvas shoes. He fell to his knees. He stood up, stumbled a few more yards, and fell again. He was slowing the sledge down to a crawl. The other 4 men, starving and freezing themselves, were burning massive amounts of their own vanishing energy just to compensate for his dead weight. Scott made a brutal, necessary command decision. He ordered Evans to unbuckle his harness. He told the giant to walk unburdened alongside the sledge, or to follow their tracks at his own pace. They would push ahead, set up the camp, and wait for him to arrive. Evans nodded blankly. He stepped out of the traces. Scott, Wilson, Bowers, and Oates leaned forward and pulled the sledge away, disappearing into the swirling whiteout. When they reached the designated camping spot near a massive, towering formation known as Monument Rock, they pitched the canvas tent. They fired up the Primus stove, the precious limited paraffin oil roaring to life, and began to boil the tea. They waited. An hour passed. The tea grew cold. The blizzard howled against the thin walls of the tent. Evans did not appear. A profound, sickening dread settled over the 4 men. They knew with absolute certainty that a man in Evans's condition could not survive alone on the ice. They zipped up their heavy windproof jackets, stepped out of the tent, and began to retrace their own sledge tracks through the drifting snow. They walked back for nearly an hour, their eyes straining against the blinding white. And then they saw him. He was a dark lump against the perfect white of the glacier, kneeling in the snow. As they ran toward him, the horrific reality of his condition came into focus. Evans was on his hands and knees. His heavy canvas jacket was unbuttoned, exposing his chest to the sub-zero wind. His gloves were gone, his bare blackened hands buried deep in the freezing snow. When they reached him, Dr. Wilson dropped to his knees and grabbed his shoulders. Evans looked up. His eyes were wide, panicked, and completely devoid of recognition. He did not know who they were. He did not know where he was. The giant was gone. Only the terrified, dying animal remained. "What is it, Taff?" Scott asked, his voice cracking against. "I don't know," Evans whispered. His voice, his lips, cracked and bleeding from the scurvy, moved slowly. "I don't know," Evans whispered, his voice a frail, reedy rasp. I thought I must have fainted. Those were his last words. As Wilson and Bowers desperately tried to pull him to his feet, Evans's massive body went entirely limp. He collapsed face forward into the snow, descending into a deep, unshakable coma. The logistics of moving a 200-pound, unconscious man in the Antarctic are a nightmare. The 4 starving, exhausted men had to run back to the camp, retrieve the empty sledge, drag it back up the incline, and physically heave Evans's dead weight onto the wooden slats. They strapped him down like cargo and pulled him back to the tent, their muscles screaming in agony, their lungs burning in the freezing air. They dragged him into the cramped, dark interior of the tent. They forced his freezing body into his reindeer fur sleeping bag. Doctor Wilson sat beside him, feeling for a pulse, watching the slow, ragged rise and fall of the giant's chest. There was nothing medical science could do. There was no medicine, no oxygen, no warmth. There was only the sound of the wind tearing at the canvas and the terrifying wet rattle of Evans's breathing. The 4 men sat in silence, watching the strongest piece of their machinery slowly shut down. Shortly after midnight, at 12:30 a.m. on February 18th, the ragged breathing stopped. The silence in the tent became absolute, heavier even than the wind outside. Petty Officer Edgar Evans was dead. The psychological impact of his death was devastating. Scott and his men were Victorian officers. They were accustomed to the concept of death in battle, a sudden, glorious end. But this was different. This was a slow, methodical biological deconstruction. They had watched the continent systematically strip away Evans's strength, his mind, and his life, piece by agonizing piece, and, looking at his massive, frozen body, taking up a quarter of the space in their tiny tent, the remaining 4 men could no longer deny the terrifying reality of their own bodies. They were all suffering from the same scurvy. They were all operating on the same caloric deficit. They were all wearing the same frozen clothing. They were not just burying a friend. They were looking at a mirror. They could not carry the body. They wrapped Edgar Evans in his canvas sledge cover, dragged him out into the freezing wind, and buried him in a shallow grave at the base of the Beardmore Glacier. They piled heavy blocks of blue ice over his resting place to protect him from the wind, leaving a small nameless cairn at the gateway to the mountains. When Scott, Wilson, Bowers, and Oates strapped themselves back into the hauling harnesses the next morning, the weight of the sledge was lighter, but the psychological burden was infinitely heavier. They had survived the high plateau. They had survived the terrifying descent of the glass mountain. They were back on the flat expanse of the Great Ice Barrier, but they were a man down. The brief Antarctic summer was dead. The temperature was plunging toward negative 40 degrees, and the massive, 400-mile expanse of the barrier stretched out before them, an endless white ocean standing between them and the safety of the wooden hut. The giant had fallen. The endgame had begun, and the ice was preparing to claim the rest. Chapter 9. The Sacrifice. When Petty Officer Edgar Evans died at the base of the Beardmore Glacier, the psychological architecture of the Terra Nova Expedition fundamentally cracked. He was the strongest man among them, the physical anchor of the hauling team. His death proved that sheer willpower could no longer override the biological reality of their starvation. But as Captain Robert Falcon Scott, Dr. Edward Wilson, Lieutenant Henry Bowers, and Captain Lawrence Oates buried their giant under the blue ice and turned their faces north, they were greeted by a landscape that offered absolutely no quarter. They were back on the Great Ice Barrier. To the human eye, the barrier looks like a flat, frozen ocean, a straight, 400-mile shot back to the safety of the wooden hut at Cape Evans. It should have been the easiest part of the journey, but the Antarctic is a master of meteorological deception. It was late February. The brief pale illusion of the polar summer had officially died. The sun was beginning its long, slow retreat toward the horizon, dragging the temperature down with it. The thermometer plummeted to -30, then -40 degrees Fahrenheit. At these temperatures, the physical properties of the world begin to malfunction. The snow beneath their boots ceased to act like snow. It lost all of its lubricating moisture and crystallized into a sharp, abrasive powder. Captain Scott described it in his diary as pulling a sledge over dry desert sand. The metal runners of the heavy wooden sledge no longer glided. They ground into the surface with immense, agonizing friction. Every single step the 4 remaining men took required a violent, full-body lunge against the canvas-hauling harnesses. They were essentially dragging hundreds of pounds of dead weight through a beach of crushed glass, and as the friction increased, their internal fuel supply catastrophically failed. The strategy for the return march relied entirely on a chain of supply depots they had laid on the way out. These depots, marked by a single fluttering black flag on a bamboo pole, contained their pemmican, their biscuits, and most importantly, their tins of paraffin oil. Paraffin was their lifeblood. It fueled the small primus stoves, required to melt the ice into drinking water and boil their dense, fatty food. But when the starving, exhausted men finally reached the first depot on the barrier and dug the supplies out of the snow, they made a terrifying discovery. The leather washers sealing the paraffin tins had shrunk and cracked in the extreme prolonged cold. The highly volatile fuel had slowly evaporated right through the failing seals, vanishing invisibly into the dry Antarctic air over the preceding months. They were critically, lethally short on oil. This mechanical failure triggered a rapid, cascading biological collapse. Because they didn't have enough fuel to run the stoves, they could not melt enough ice. The men were plunged into severe dehydration. Their mouths cracked and bled. Their tongues swelled in their throats, making it difficult to swallow the dry, crumbly hardtack biscuits. Worse, they could not afford the fuel to properly cook their pemmican. They were forced to eat the thick, greasy stew lukewarm. The rendered fat congealed into cold, heavy lumps in their stomachs. It provided almost no thermal energy to their freezing cores, and their starving bodies had to expend precious calories just to digest it. They were freezing from the inside out. And the man who was freezing the fastest was Captain Lawrence Titus Oates. Oates was the cavalry officer, the quiet, stoic soldier who had lovingly tended to the doomed ponies until their brutal execution at Shambles Camp. Throughout the entire journey, he had been a pillar of Victorian endurance, never complaining, simply putting his head down and pulling the sledge. But Oates was hiding a dark, agonizing secret inside his heavy canvas: finnesko boots. Like the rest of the men, Oates was suffering from advanced scurvy. His body had stopped producing collagen, the biological glue that repairs tissue. Earlier in the expedition, his feet had become severely frostbitten. In a healthy body, the dead tissue would eventually slough off, and the body would attempt to heal the margins. But without vitamin C, Oates's body could not heal. The frostbite had progressed into deep necrotic gangrene. His feet had turned a sickening bruised black. They had swollen to twice their normal size, the skin pulled tight and weeping with infection. The nerves in his extremities were dying, sending constant blinding shock waves of agony up his legs and into his spine. Every morning, the routine inside the tiny freezing tent became a waking nightmare. Because the temperature was -40, their canvas boots froze as hard as cast iron overnight. To get his boots on, Oates had to use his frostbitten hands to violently beat the rigid canvas with a wooden mallet, trying to soften the material just enough to force his swollen, rotting feet inside. The pain was so absolute, so transcendent, that it defies human description. He was physically crushing his own gangrenous flesh into a frozen vice every single day. And then he had to stand up, strap the heavy canvas, hauling harness across his chest, and walk for 10 hours. By the first week of March, Oates could no longer pull. He was limping, dragging his dead, blackened feet through the abrasive snow, falling behind the sledge. The military cohesion of the unit was shattering. Scott, Wilson, and Bowers were forced to stop constantly, waiting in the freezing wind for Oates to catch up. Oates knew exactly what was happening. He was a military man. He understood logistics, and he understood the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of their situation. Every hour he delayed the march, they burned more calories they didn't have. Every extra day they spent on the ice, they consumed rations and paraffin that were already running out. He was the anchor. He was the dead weight pulling the rest of the team down into the abyss. If he lived, his 3 friends would die. The psychological torment of this realization was heavier than the physical pain of his rotting flesh. Oates was a proud man, deeply entrenched in the Edwardian ideals of honor and self-sacrifice. The thought that his weakness was killing his comrades was intolerable to him. One evening, inside the dark, smoky, freezing tent, Oates turned to Dr. Edward Wilson. He knew that Wilson carried a small medical kit containing opium and morphine. Oates quietly asked the doctor to give him the drugs. He did not ask for pain relief. He was asking for a lethal dose. He wanted to end his own life quickly, so the others could take his rations and make a desperate sprint for the next depot. Dr. Wilson, bound by his medical oath and his deep religious faith, refused. He told Oates to keep marching. He told him they would all make it together, or they would all die together. It was a noble sentiment, but on the great ice barrier, nobility is a fatal luxury. On March 15th, the temperature plummeted again. The wind picked up, a howling, blinding gale that swept across the flat white desert. Oates could barely stand. His feet were completely destroyed. His hands were frostbitten. He stumbled into the tent that night, his face a mask of grey, sunken exhaustion. He lay in his frozen, damp reindeer skin sleeping bag, shivering violently. He knew that the morning would bring another day of dragging his rotting body through the snow, delaying his friends, consuming their microscopic chance of survival. He had made his decision. On the morning of March the 16th, or perhaps the 17th, as the starving men had lost track of the exact dates in their misery, they awoke to a terrifying sound. The wind had escalated into a massive, shrieking blizzard. A force 10 gale was tearing at the thin canvas walls of their tent. The temperature outside was easily 40 below zero, but with the wind chill, the air was instantly lethal. There was no visibility. There would be no marching that day. They were pinned down. Inside the tent, the 4 men lay in their bags, listening to the roar of the continent. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed wool, paraffin soot, and the sweet, sickening odor of Oates's gangrene. Oates stirred. He slowly unzipped his heavy sleeping bag. He did not put on his boots. His feet were too swollen, and he no longer needed them. He did not ask for help. Scott, Wilson, and Bowers watched him in silence. They knew. The unwritten, unspoken rules of their desperate brotherhood hung heavy in the freezing air. Nobody tried to stop him. To stop him would be to deny him his final agency, and to condemn them all to a slow, starving death together. Captain Lawrence Oates dragged himself toward the entrance of the tent. He pushed open the frozen canvas flap. The screaming, white chaos of the blizzard instantly filled the small space, biting into their exposed faces. Oates paused. He turned his head back toward his 3 friends. His face was ravaged by the ice, blackened and gaunt, but his voice was remarkably steady. He spoke the words that would echo through the halls of history, a chilling testament to the absolute limits of human sacrifice. "I am just going outside," Oates said softly over the roar of the wind, "and maybe some time." He pushed himself through the flap. The canvas fell shut behind him. Inside the tent, Scott, Wilson, and Bowers lay in absolute paralyzed silence. They listened. They strained to hear the crunch of his footsteps, but the howling of the blizzard instantly swallowed him whole. He had walked out into a whiteout at 40 degrees below zero in his socks to face the abyss alone. He knew the cold would stop his heart in a matter of minutes. He was offering his body to the ice so that his friends could take his share of the food, shed his dead weight, and live. It was an act of profound, terrifying courage. But as the 3 remaining men lay in the dark, the horrific reality of the great ice barrier settled over them once more. The sacrifice had been made. The military anchor was gone. Yet, as the blizzard raged on, tearing at the fabric of their only shelter, they knew the brutal truth. Oates's sacrifice had bought them nothing but a few extra days of agony. They were still 11 miles from the next depot. They had almost no food and no fuel. The giant had fallen. The soldier had sacrificed himself. Now, Only the captain, the doctor, and the navigator remained, waiting for the wind to die down so they could begin the final, doomed march to their own frozen graves. When Captain Lawrence Oates stepped out of the tent and into the howling, -40-degree whiteout, he took the last fragments of the expedition's psychological armor with him. Inside the small green canvas, Shelter, Captain Robert Falcon Scott, Dr. Edward Wilson, and Lieutenant Henry Bowers lay in absolute silence. They listened to the violent, tearing sound of the blizzard striking the fabric just inches from their faces. They did not speak of what had just happened. They were Edwardian officers. They understood the brutal, unspoken mathematics of the ice. Oates had walked into the abyss to shed his own dead weight, offering his life to buy them a fraction of a chance. But as the blizzard raged on for the rest of the day and into the night, the horrific, crushing reality of the great ice barrier settled over the three survivors. Oates's sacrifice was a breathtaking act of courage, but mathematically it had changed nothing. When the wind finally broke enough for them to emerge, they looked out over the vast, flat expanse of the frozen ocean. There was no sign of Oates. There were no tracks. The continent had swallowed him whole, erasing him as if he had never existed. The three remaining men strapped the heavy canvas harnesses across their chests for what they knew would be the last few times. They leaned their weight into the sledge. The drag of the runners against the abrasive frozen sand of the ice shelf was agonizing. Without Edgar Evans's massive strength, and without Oates to help pull, the physical burden on the last three men was apocalyptic. They were completely out of fuel. They could no longer melt ice for water, and they could no longer cook their pemmican. They were eating the dense, greasy meat paste entirely cold, their swollen, bleeding gums chewing on the hardened blocks. They were profoundly dehydrated, their mouths feeling like cracked leather. Scott's right foot had finally succumbed to the same gangrenous frostbite that had claimed Oates. In his diary, Scott noted with a detached, clinical horror that his foot had swollen entirely out of shape. He wrote that, if he were to somehow survive and make it back to civilization, amputation was an absolute certainty. But there was no hospital here. There was only the ice. He had to force his rotting, black foot into his frozen canvas boot every single morning and drag a sledge. On March 20th, 1912, they managed to drag themselves to a point where they were forced to stop and pitch the tent. They sat inside the freezing, dark interior and calculated their position. They unrolled their charts. They checked their latitude. The result of that calculation is perhaps the most heartbreaking geographic statistic in the history of human exploration. They were exactly 11 miles away from One Ton Depot. 11 miles. In a modern vehicle, it is a 10-minute drive. For a healthy man on a cool autumn afternoon, it is a brisk 3-hour walk. But for three starving, crippled men, hauling a dead weight through -40-degree temperatures, 11 miles might as well have been the distance to the moon. One Ton Depot was a massive mountain of food and fuel. It contained hundreds of pounds of hot cooked meals, gallons of paraffin oil to warm their freezing bodies, and the physical salvation of the British Empire. It was right there, just over the horizon. They resolved to leave the heavy sledge behind. They would wake up the next morning, carry only what they could fit in their pockets, and make a desperate, unburdened sprint for the depot. But the Antarctic is not a passive environment. It is an active, malevolent force. And it was not going to let them leave. That night, a massive, unseasonable weather system stalled directly over the great ice barrier. The wind began to howl, rising rapidly from a strong breeze to a deafening, sustained hurricane of freezing air and blinding snow. They were pinned down. On March 21st, the blizzard raged. They could not see their own hands extended in front of their faces. If they stepped outside the tent, they would be instantly disoriented, lost in the whiteout, and frozen solid within minutes. They had to wait. They lay in their reindeer skin sleeping bags. They had 2 days of cold food left. They had no heat. The temperature inside the tent was indistinguishable from the temperature outside. On March 22nd, the blizzard continued. The walls of the tent snapped and cracked like rifle fire. On March 23rd, the blizzard continued. As the days bled into one another, The three men realized that the tent they had pitched was not a temporary shelter. It was their tomb. The realization did not bring panic. They were too exhausted, too cold, and too disciplined for panic. Instead, it brought a profound, heavy clarity. They were scientists, and they were military men. They could feel the biological processes of their own bodies shutting down. They could feel the cold slowly creeping up their extremities, moving toward their hearts. It was in this freezing, roaring darkness that Captain Robert Falcon Scott performed his final defining act of leadership. He could not save his men's lives, but he could save their legacy. Scott pulled his canvas satchel toward him. His hands were severely frostbitten, the skin blackened, the nerves dead. He could barely feel his fingers. But through a sheer incomprehensible act of willpower, he gripped his pencil, opened his diaries, and began to write. He wrote a letter to his wife Kathleen, telling her to ensure their young son, Peter, was brought up to be interested in natural history, urging her to keep him out into the open air. He wrote to the mother of Dr. Edward Wilson, telling her that her son had died exactly as he had lived, a brave, true man with no fear of death, his mind entirely at peace. He wrote to the mother of Lieutenant Bowers, telling her of her son's unrelenting cheerfulness, even as the end approached, calling him the hardest traveller that ever undertook a polar journey. And finally, as the food ran out and the cold began to claim his consciousness, Scott wrote his message to the public. It is a masterclass in stoic, tragic prose, written by a man who knew his words would only be read over his dead body. We took risks, we knew we took them. Things have come out against us, and therefore we have no cause for complaint, but bow to the will of Providence, determined still to do our best to the last. Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions, which would have stirred the heart of every Englishman. These rough notes and our dead bodies must tell the tale. The handwriting in the diaries tells a physical story. The early entries of the expedition are written in a sharp, elegant, sweeping script. But as the days in the final tent progressed, the handwriting degrades. It becomes jagged, chaotic, and faint. It is the visual record of a man's central nervous system failing him in real time. His final entry is dated March 29th, 1912. The blizzard had been howling continuously for 9 days. Every day we have been ready to start for our depot 11 miles away, but outside the door of the tent it remains a scene of whirling drift. I do not think we can hope for any better things now. We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. Ah, Scott, for God's sake look after our people. He dropped the pencil. The silence that eventually descended inside the tent was heavier than the ice itself. Dr. Edward Wilson and Lieutenant Henry Bowers were the first to pass. They closed their eyes, their bodies slipping quietly into severe hypothermia, their hearts simply slowing down until they stopped. Scott was the last to die. We know this because of the way the bodies were found. After his two friends passed, Scott unbuttoned his heavy coat, throwing open the flaps to let the freezing air directly against his chest, speeding up the inevitable. He reached out his frostbitten hand and draped his arm across the body of Dr. Wilson, his closest friend. And then Captain Scott closed his eyes. The wind continued to scream across the great ice barrier, burying the small green tent in the drifting snow. The expedition was over. The continent had won. 8 months later, in November of 1912, the Antarctic summer had returned. A search party had set out from the wooden hut at Cape Evans, slowly making their way across the barrier, looking for any sign of the men who had vanished into the whiteout nearly a year before. As they marched, a sharp-eyed member of the team spotted something unusual, breaking the perfect, infinite white horizon. It looked like a small snowdrift, but the geometry was too sharp. They approached slowly. Sticking out of the hard-packed snow were the top few inches of a bamboo tent pole. The search party stopped. The air grew heavy. They took out their shovels and began to dig. As they swept the snow away, the green canvas of the tent was revealed. They carefully unlaced the frozen door flap and looked inside. The scene they found was not one of horror or struggle, but of profound, devastating peace. The freezing temperatures had perfectly preserved the men. They looked like statues carved from white marble. Wilson and Bowers lay with their hands neatly folded inside their sleeping bags, looking entirely at rest. Scott lay between them, the flaps of his sleeping bag open, his arms still draped protectively over Wilson. The search party wept as they gathered the diaries, the letters, and the rolls of undeveloped film. They found the 35 pounds of geological rock samples that the men had dragged down the Beardmore Glacier. Even as they were starving to death, they had refused to abandon the science. The searchers did not move the bodies. They realized that no grave in England could ever be as fitting for these men as the one they had chosen themselves. They collapsed the green canvas tent over the bodies, allowing it to serve as a shroud. Over the tent, they built a massive cairn of solid snow blocks, 12 feet high. On top of the cairn, they lashed 2 wooden skis together to form a crude cross, standing stark against the endless white sky. When the news finally reached civilization, it shook the world. Roald Amundsen had won the race. He had reached the pole, planted his flag, and returned his entire team to safety without losing a single man. From a logistical standpoint, Amundsen was the superior explorer, but history is rarely decided by logistics alone. When Scott's letters were published in the newspapers of London, New York, and Paris, they elevated the disaster into a mythic tragedy. Scott's beautiful, heartbreaking prose framed their deaths not as a failure of planning, but as the ultimate triumph of the human spirit over impossible odds. Amundsen had won the pole, but Scott had won immortality. Today, that final tent still sits on the Great Ice Barrier, but the barrier is not solid ground. It is a massive, floating ice shelf that is constantly, imperceptibly moving outward toward the sea. Over the last century, the snow has continued to fall, burying the tent under perhaps 100 feet of solid ice. The sheer weight of the continent has slowly pushed the tomb northward. Sometime in the distant future, perhaps centuries from now, that piece of the ice shelf will reach the edge of the Ross Sea. It will crack, violently severing from the continent, and carve into a massive iceberg. And deep inside that iceberg, perfectly preserved in the dark, 3 men will finally begin their journey home, drifting silently out into the open ocean. Welcome back to the light. Thank you for joining me on this journey to the bottom of the earth. The Terra Nova Expedition is a story that has haunted me for years. There is something fundamentally terrifying about the quiet, slow inevitability of the ice. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It wasn't a violent disaster. It was just a group of men, walking into a white room and realizing the door had locked behind them. I want to know what part of this story got under your skin the most. Was it the execution of the ponies? Was it the endless march over the hidden crevasses? Or was it Captain Oates walking out into the blizzard? Scroll down into the comments and let me know. If you made it all the way to the end of this 2-hour ambient deep dive, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel was built for. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who appreciates dark, atmospheric history. Until then, stay safe, keep the lights on. I'll see you in the next one.